In the summer of 1941, the world tilted toward a clash so vast it would swallow entire nations. On June 22nd, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Nearly 4 million Axis troops surged across a front stretching more than 1,000 miles, supported by thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft. Hitler promised a lightning victory, certain the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks. What followed instead was a war of distance, endurance, and ruin that reshaped the century. The first blows were shattering. Soviet armies were encircled by fast-moving panzer groups, cities burned, roads filled with refugees and retreating soldiers. Within months, the Germans stood at Leningrad's gates, tightened a noose around Kiev, and drove toward Moscow with a confidence that seemed impossible to stop. But beneath the speed and spectacle, something darker unfolded. The invasion was not only a military campaign, it was an ideological war meant to starve, enslave, and erase millions from the map. As autumn turned to winter, mud swallowed engines, frost froze rifles, and the Red Army, battered but unbroken, began to harden into a force the Germans had not imagined. This is the opening of that immense, unforgiving struggle. A story of armies, cities, and ordinary people caught inside history's most brutal front. You are watching Lullaby of Empires. The border before dawn. For months, the border had been a kind of uneasy silence. Along the long green seam where the Third Reich faced the Soviet Union, trains rumbled east and west. Farmers worked their fields, and soldiers on both sides watched one another through binoculars with the stiff patience of men told not to ask too many questions. It was not a friendly peace, but it was a peace all the same. And to many ordinary people, it felt like the world might remain suspended like this for a while longer. After all, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a pact back in 1939, and though everyone understood it was a deal between predators, it had held. 2 years of war had redrawn the map of Europe. But that frontier was meant to be steady. Yet behind the quiet, the ground was already trembling. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was not made in a sudden rush. It grew inside Hitler's mind the way a storm gathers over a dark sea, slow at first, then irresistible. He had always spoken of the East as Germany's destiny, a vast space that would feed and strengthen the Reich, a land that would be cleared of what he called undesirable peoples and turned into a colonial empire. This was not a secret dream revealed late. It sat at the center of his beliefs from the beginning. The wars in Poland and France were steps toward it, and the struggle with Britain, in his own hoped-for logic, was supposed to end quickly so the East could be taken without distraction. By 1941, that logic had hardened into certainty. The German victories in the West had been swift and humiliating for their enemies. Poland collapsed in weeks. Norway and Denmark folded quickly. France, the old rival, fell in a stunning campaign that seemed to prove to Hitler and many in his circle that speed and nerve were all that mattered. The British were pushed off the continent. Only the Soviet Union remained as the vast rival in Europe, and Hitler convinced himself that it was weaker than it looked. He believed its army had been ruined by Stalin's purges, its people resentful of communist rule, its government ready to crumble the moment a strong blow landed. He spoke confidently of cracking a rotten door. Germany's generals did not all share his certainty, but the power of recent victories had seduced them too. Many thought a war in the East would be hard, but still short. A campaign of months, not years. So the preparations began. And they began in a way that was almost surreal in its scale. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, hundreds of thousands of men, then millions, were shifted toward the Soviet frontier. Divisions that had fought in France, in the Balkans, in North Africa, were repainted, rearmed, and brought east. Panzer groups were assembled like clenched fists. Luftwaffe squadrons moved into forward airfields. Engineers widened roads, repaired bridges, mapped rivers. Every day, the Reich's railways carried more supplies: shells, fuel, spare parts, rations, winter gear that was never enough. Medical stores, endless coils of barbed wire. The machinery of conquest rolled forward, quietly at first, then with a momentum so huge it could no longer be hidden from anyone paying attention. To the German soldier, the move east did not always feel like the opening of a world-shattering campaign. Many were young men who had experienced victory after victory. The war had always meant marching into new capitals, raising flags, being told they were unstoppable. They had crossed borders before and found roads leading toward triumph. The East was presented to them as the next chapter of that same story. Some were excited, some fearful, most simply obedient. They watched the Soviet landscape from trucks and train cars, wide plains, forests, muddy paths, villages that looked older than anything in Germany. The land had a quiet, distant feel, as though it was waiting. To the men in uniform, waiting rarely seemed dangerous. On the Soviet side, the situation was stranger still. Stalin had reason to expect an invasion. He had been warned by intelligence agents, by foreign governments, by even his own advisors. The German buildup was visible. Everyone could see it. And yet Stalin clung to a belief that Hitler would not dare to attack until Britain was crushed, or at least until Germany had forced Britain to negotiate. Stalin thought the Reich would not risk a two-front war. He did not trust the warnings. Some of them came from people he distrusted for years. Others sounded too urgent, too dramatic, like traps meant to provoke him into making the first move and giving Hitler a justification. He had also watched Germany maneuver and bluff before. He had watched diplomats lie for advantage. And in the cold theater of statecraft, he believed he could read Hitler better than others could. He was wrong. The Red Army on the frontier was enormous on paper, but it was not ready in spirit or structure. The purges of the late 1930s had ripped away much of its experienced leadership. Many skilled officers had been executed, imprisoned, or removed, replaced by men who were loyal but often cautious. Training had been uneven, reorganization chaotic. New tanks were being produced but not always delivered or properly crewed. Aircraft existed in large numbers, but many were outdated and parked in tight clusters on airfields that were too close to the border. Supply depots were forward and vulnerable. The army possessed strength, but it was strength caught in mid-step, still learning to walk after a blow to the head. In those last weeks before the invasion, the Soviet borderlands were a land of tension that never quite became clarity. Commanders sent urgent reports to Moscow. Some were told to act, others to stay calm. Orders shifted. One day, units were told to prepare quietly. The next day, they were instructed not to provoke the Germans. In some places, Soviet soldiers were forbidden from even returning fire if incidents occurred. It was as if the state hoped that by refusing to believe, it could change reality's mind. And so, the border waited. In towns and villages across Western Soviet territory, in Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic lands, normal life continued with a nervous undercurrent. Factories worked, trains rolled, children ran through summer streets, families tended gardens. There was hardship, yes, and fear, yes, but war, in the way humans learned to live beside it, had become a distant rumble rather than a daily storm. The Soviet Union was still a place where survival had already demanded toughness. People remembered famine, repression, arrests in the night. They understood what the state could do to the individual. Yet they also believed, because they were told to believe, that the Red Army was strong, that the borders were secure, that the German threat was political drama rather than immediate danger. The image of invulnerability was part of daily air, and many breathed it in, even if they felt a faint unease in their lungs. On the German side, the pace of preparation grew feverish. The invasion was given a code name that carried ancient weight, Operation Barbarossa, after the medieval emperor who had marched to the east centuries before. The choice of name was not accidental. Hitler loved symbols that made him feel like history's heir. The plan itself was a monument to confidence. 3 enormous army groups would open the assault. Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the strongest, would smash into Belarus and surge for Moscow. Army Group South would sweep into Ukraine and seize its fertile plains and industrial heart. The objective was not simply to push back the Red Army, but to destroy it in giant encirclements near the border before it could retreat and regroup. The German High Command expected a decisive victory within 10 weeks. They pictured Soviet forces collapsing in great pockets, the state falling apart, the rest of the campaign becoming more of a march than a battle. To make this happen, the Reich gathered the largest invasion force ever assembled on the continent. Nearly 4 million Axis troops, Germans supported by Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, Finns, Slovaks, and others, formed a front more than 1,000 miles long. Around 3,500 tanks waited in concealed assembly areas. Over 2,000 aircraft sat ready to strike. Hundreds of thousands of trucks and carts, and almost 750,000 horses were prepared to carry supplies east. It was a weapon made of metal and flesh, stretched to an unimaginable length, waiting for a single order to lunge. In the final days, secrecy tightened like a fist. German soldiers were told the hour was near, but not exactly when. Some were handed pamphlets describing the Soviet Union as a land of chaos and inferiority, a place to be conquered easily. Others were instructed about the ideological nature of the war, warned that Soviet commissars and partisans were to be treated with no mercy. Even before the first shot, the invasion carried a shadow that was more than military. It was meant not only to defeat an enemy army, but to unmake a society. Behind the front line stood special units mapped for terror, security divisions, police battalions, Einsatzgruppen, trained to hunt political officials, Jews, and anyone defined as an obstacle to the Nazi vision. The war was designed to be ruthless from the start. It was not going to be a battle for territory alone, but a campaign of annihilation. Meanwhile, in Stalin's Kremlin, the contradictions continued. Even on June 21st, with German formations packed tightly along the frontier, Stalin sent out messages insisting that provocation must be avoided. The Soviet leadership did issue some last-minute alerts, but they came too late and too cautiously. Many units remained in vulnerable positions. Ammunition was locked away in depots requiring special orders to open. Aircraft remained lined up in neat rows. The Red Army had plans for defensive war, but only if the alarm had been raised in time. It had plans for offensive war too, but those were half-formed and uncertain. The gap between what existed on paper and what existed on the ground was the kind that can only be measured by catastrophe. Late that night, the frontier felt calm, in a way that now seems almost tragic. Soldiers on both sides heard crickets in the grass, the distant bark of dogs, the low talk of men standing watch. Some Germans wrote last letters home, promising their mothers they would be safe, promising their wives they would return soon. Some Soviets played cards, smoked cigarettes, listened to radio music drifting over fields. The air was warm. The river water moved slowly. The dark was soft. Then, before dawn, the storm broke. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the German artillery opened fire. Along the entire front, thousands of guns lit the night with sudden white flashes. The sound rolled like thunder, not in a single place but in a continuous wall of explosions traveling across forests and fields. Within minutes, Soviet border posts were shredded. Communication lines snapped. Barracks and depots ignited. Bridges that had been watched peacefully only hours before were now crossed by assault troops with grenades and flamethrowers. The first waves of German infantry moved forward under the cover of shell fire, while engineers threw pontoons across rivers already choked with smoke. Above them, the Luftwaffe rose into the early sky and struck Soviet airfields in coordinated raids. Planes still on the ground were destroyed in huge numbers before they could take off. The neat rows of Soviet aircraft became charred skeletons. This was the opening move of blitzkrieg, the same move that had stunned Europe. Blind the enemy, cut the nerves, then punch deep before they can breathe. At the same moment, German panzer groups surged forward. Tanks rolled over the border like iron insects, fast and confident, their tracks tearing through farmland and road shoulder. Behind them came motorized infantry, supply columns, and endless dust clouds rising in the morning sun. The invasion was so broad and so sudden that for many Soviet units it felt unreal. Some commanders refused to believe the reports. Others hesitated, waiting for orders that no longer made sense. Some border guards fought immediately. Some were overwhelmed before they could fire a shot. In many places, the first line of defense was wiped out in minutes. In cities just behind the border, people woke to a new kind of sound. Not the familiar rumble of trains or factory whistles, but the booming of artillery and the strange, distant roar of aircraft. Some ran into streets. Some listened to official radio announcements that were slow to come. When they came, they announced the unthinkable. Germany had attacked. The war that had been a phantom on the horizon was now in the front yard. The opening hours of Barbarossa carried a rough, unstoppable momentum. German forces pierced Soviet defenses at dozens of points. Within the first day, they had advanced miles in some sectors. Soviet counterattacks were thrown out quickly, often without coordination, sometimes without fuel or air cover. Yet even in these first hours, the invasion did not go smoothly everywhere. There were pockets of fierce Soviet resistance, infantry that stood their ground in burning villages, artillery crews that fired until they were surrounded, pilots who rose in damaged aircraft to meet attackers above their own airfields. The myth of Soviet collapse on contact was not entirely true, but the scale of the German blow was so massive that even heroic resistance looked like candles in a hurricane. For Hitler, listening to reports from his headquarters, this was the fulfillment of the Eastern Dream. In Berlin, the propaganda machine began to speak of liberation and destiny. The public was told a final great victory was underway. German newspapers called it a crusade against Bolshevism. But on the ground, among the men crossing rivers and pushing through smoke, it was simpler. An order carried out with speed, a frontier erased, an enemy struck before he could fully awaken. For Stalin, the news landed like a physical blow. He had not expected this moment now, in this form. For a short time he went silent, stunned. Then he began to act with the cold force of a man who could only respond in one way, by demanding resistance, by calling up every reserve, by ordering no retreat that was not explicitly permitted. The Soviet Union had been jolted into the most desperate fight of its existence. And for the vast civilian world caught in the path of the invasion, the first day was the beginning of a new kind of life. A life in which homes could vanish in an afternoon, in which roads could become rivers of refugees, in which survival would be tested not by years but by hours. The border that had waited in uneasy quiet was now a blaze of movement. The war had begun, not as a single battle, but as a continent-wide eruption. As the sun rose on June 22nd, columns of German armor were already pushing deeper into Soviet territory. The Red Army, shaken and disoriented, was scrambling to understand the scale of the blow. The invasion had started like lightning, striking a forest. One flash, then fire everywhere. In the days to come, the German plan would unfold with terrifying speed. Great pockets closing, armies swallowed, cities placed under siege. The summer would turn into a race between German momentum and Soviet survival, and the first chapters of that race were already being written in smoke. The road to the east lay open, and the German juggernaut was rolling. The first shockwave's dawn on June 22, 1941 did not arrive in a single moment. It arrived in thousands. Along nearly 2,000 miles of frontier, the sky kept splitting open. First with artillery, then with engines, then with smoke. For the people who lived in those borderlands, the morning felt less like an attack and more like the earth turning against them. Entire villages woke to a horizon that was suddenly on fire, and even before anyone understood what was happening, the war had already moved past their doorsteps, rushing inward like a flood that would not slow. For the German High Command, these first days were supposed to be a clean opening act to a short campaign. 3 massive army groups rolled forward at once, north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow, south into Ukraine, supported by almost 4 million Axis soldiers and an air force meant to paralyze Soviet movement from the first hour. World history. Edu. On paper, it looked like the final proof of the lightning war idea: speed, surprise, encirclement, collapse. But paper wars never include what a real frontier is like at sunrise. They don't include the soft bogs and thick forests that swallow roads. They don't include commanders waking to cut telephone wires, units scattered across training grounds, or aircraft lined up wing to wing on airfields that were about to become target practice. In the Soviet border districts, the first hours were confusion sharpened into terror. Some units fought at once. Some waited for orders that never arrived. Some were already surrounded before they understood the front had moved. Army Group Center struck hardest and fastest, because in German eyes the road to Moscow was the war's spine. Panzer Groups 2 and 3 pushed through Belarus with the confidence of a machine that had never yet been denied. Their armored columns bypassed strongpoints, left infantry to mop up, and drove deep for crossings and rail hubs. The Soviet Western Front, stretched across the border in long, rigid lines, was the kind of formation that looked orderly on maps and fatal in motion. Once the German spearhead slipped behind it, the lines didn't bend. They broke. Within the first week, the battle around Białystok and Minsk swelled into a giant pocket, one of the earliest catastrophes of the invasion. German armor closed from north and south, and whole Soviet armies found themselves crushed in a tightening ring. In those woods and fields, tens of thousands tried to escape in loose columns at night, listening for tank tracks in the dark and aircraft overhead by day. But the ring held. When it finally sealed, the Germans reported more than 300,000 prisoners taken in that opening encirclement alone. World History. Encyclopedia. The roads leading east became ribbons of defeated men, dusty at first, then muddy, then bloody, watched over by guards who were already exhausted, yet still stunned by the scale of what they had captured. To understand those early weeks, it helps to picture what encirclement feels like from inside. At first, it is a rumor, then a silence on the radio, then a sense that the horizon is wrong. Too many German vehicles moving where Soviet ones should be. Then, the slow mechanical certainty of realizing the roads behind you are no longer yours. The Soviet soldier in that pocket was not thinking about ideology or strategy. He was thinking about water, a path through the birch trees, a night without aircraft, and the shape of the next ridge. Most carried only what they could hold: a rifle, a tin cup, a handful of cartridges. Many had no rifle at all, waiting for one to be issued. Hunger arrived quickly because depots were overrun or bombed, and the countryside they moved through was already set alight by retreating Soviet forces. The pocket wasn't just a battlefield. It was a sealed world where time itself started to feel different, stretched, heavy, and short. German commanders believed this was the proof they needed. Minsk fell after days rather than weeks. Soviet formations dissolved. Aircraft burned on the ground. The highway east opened like a promise. Yet, even as German reports celebrated the brilliance of their first victories, something quieter was also taking shape. Pockets do not vanish instantly. Hundreds of thousands of trapped men do not surrender all at once. They fight in fragments. They break out in small groups. Some escape into forests, becoming the first raw materials for partisan war. The German timetable, already strict, began to thicken with delays. Meanwhile, to the north, Army Group North moved through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. The terrain there was narrow and difficult. Lakes, rivers, pine forests, marshes, but the Germans pressed forward with a purpose that was partly military and partly symbolic. Leningrad was not simply a city on their map. In Hitler's worldview, it was a hated emblem, meant to be erased. Army Group North's advance was stubborn and relentless, breaking Soviet border units, forcing retreats through Riga and beyond, moving closer to the Neva. World history. Edu. In these first weeks, the Soviet Northern Front bled heavily, trying to delay an enemy that refused to slow down. To the south, Army Group South entered a different kind of war. Ukraine was wide, open, rich, and hot in summer, and it produced battles that looked less like sudden collapses and more like rolling pressure. The Soviet Southwestern Front was large and stubborn. Here, the Germans did not always find immediate gaps. They found resistance, counterattacks, and cities that would not fall in a single afternoon. Still, their armor worked around fixed defenses, probing for crossings, driving for the deep rear. The enormous spaces of Ukraine invited the same maneuver logic that had succeeded in France, and in July and August those spaces began to fold into new encirclements. Uman, then the looming shape of Kiev. World History Encyclopedia. But in Chapter 2 we are still in the first shockwave, the time when the German advance felt unstoppable, and the Soviet response was still being invented in real time. Across all three sectors, one feature was the same: air power. The Luftwaffe did not merely support the ground war, it tried to own the tempo of it. Bridges, rail junctions, road columns, airfields, depots, anything that moved or fed movement was hunted. The effect on Soviet command was suffocating. A headquarters without telephone lines and without radios is a mind without nerves. Front commanders struggled to understand where their armies were, because by the time a report arrived, those armies had already been cut off. Yet history is never only about machines. It is about people inside machines. On the Soviet side, there were two wars starting at once. One was the War of the Front. The other was the war of survival behind it. As German units surged forward, the occupation policy, already brutal in intention, began to show its face in practice. Villages found themselves stripped of food. Jewish communities were marked out for immediate violence. Young men were seized for forced labor. Suspected partisans were shot. Houses were burned as warnings. Even in the first weeks, civilians understood that this invasion was not only about territory, it was about existence. The fear that spread through the countryside ran deeper than the sound of guns. It carried the cold knowledge that surrender did not mean safety. In Moscow, the shock was almost physical. The Soviet leadership had believed war might come, but not so soon, not so deep, not so fast. Stalin's first responses were a mixture of denial and fury, the kind that belongs to a ruler who suddenly finds real life larger than his plans. Yet the state began to move. Orders went out to mobilize men, evacuate industry, intensify security, and prepare cities for siege. The early defeats did not erase Soviet capacity. They exposed weakness, then forced adaptation. For the German soldier, those same days earned a different feeling. He had crossed the border in summer, when the world smelled of wheat and river water, and he had been told that the enemy was a brittle colossus. In his letters home, he wrote of huge prisoner columns and abandoned tanks, of endless roads east. He believed the war was almost over, because that is what victories always feel like the future arriving early. But the land already began to whisper otherwise. The distances felt strange to men raised in Western Europe, where a day's drive could cross a country. Here, a day's drive barely seemed to change the horizon. Each captured city revealed more road, more river, more forest. Victory felt wide, but also thin, stretched like a thread laid too far from its spool. And on both sides, fatigue began earlier than expected. The German campaign relied on momentum. The tanks needed fuel, the infantry needed trucks, the trucks needed roads, and the roads were already breaking under the weight of invasion. In June and July, the weather was clear and warm, but even then, the logistics were strained. Supply depots remained far to the west. Vehicles wore down. Horses, still essential to German transport, pulled guns the way they had in earlier wars, and in the dust of Belarus and Ukraine they began to die by the thousands. The war was moving faster than its own heartbeat. Still, in these first weeks, speed was everything. The Germans did not stop because stopping meant giving the Red Army time to wake up. They pushed on through Smolensk approaches, through river lines that were meant to be held, through defensive belts that dissolved as soon as armored groups appeared behind them. The Soviet habit of strict centralized orders proved fatal in moments that demanded initiative. Units waited for permission to retreat, and by the time permission came, retreat was no longer a road, only a forest. Yet there were also moments of fierce resistance that German diaries remembered with surprise. At Brest Fortress, Soviet defenders fought in ruins for weeks, refusing to surrender even without water. On lonely stretches of highway, Soviet anti-tank crews ambushed panzers at point-blank range, dying at their guns. In the skies, Soviet pilots in obsolete aircraft still rose to meet the Luftwaffe, sometimes ramming enemy planes when their ammunition ran out. These acts did not change the map in June, but they mattered in a quieter way. They were proof that the Soviet Union was not empty of will. It was only disorganized, and will, once organized, becomes something else. As July deepened, the first shockwave turned into a pattern. Advance, encircle, capture, advance again. To German headquarters, it was the rhythm of success. To Soviet headquarters, it was a rhythm of emergency. The Red Army began to pull units back from the border districts, to rebuild lines behind rivers, to send new formations from the interior. The first militia detachments took shape. The first factory evacuations started rolling east. The war that Germany hoped to conclude before autumn was already forcing the Soviet state into something vast and grim: total mobilization. And beneath all of it, time was quietly changing sides. Every week of German advance was also a week of German consumption, of fuel, spare parts, horses, men, and the most invisible resource of all: energy. The panzer crews were sleeping in their turrets, eating cold rations, and driving until their hands shook. The infantry were marching behind them in dust that coated throats and eyes. The Luftwaffe, flying constant sorties, wore down engines and pilots faster than replacements could arrive. Success was real, but it was also expensive. In Russia, every kilometer was longer than it looked. For the Soviets, every week of retreat was also a week of learning. Commanders who survived the first disasters began to understand the German style, how it searched for flanks, how it cut roads, how it relied on tempo. And ordinary soldiers began to absorb a darker motivation. Not the discipline of orders, but the discipline of fear. Fear of encirclement, yes, but also fear of occupation. Fear for families now behind German lines. In that fear was a hardening that would matter later. By the end of July 1941, the world could already see two truths living side by side. The first truth was German power. The invasion had torn open the Soviet West in ways few thought possible, producing prisoner counts that seemed unreal, collapsing fronts that had been expected to hold. The second truth was Soviet depth. Even as the border armies were destroyed, the Soviet Union did not collapse. It retreated and reorganized. It burned its own land rather than feed the invader. It started to move its factories and people east, and it began to form in forests and cities, the first quiet resolve that this war would not be about a line on a map, but about whether a nation could survive being struck so hard and still stand. Chapter 2 ends here, at the edge of summer, the moment when Germany is still racing forward, drunk on early victories, and the Soviet Union is still bleeding, but no longer stunned. The initial shock has passed. The war is becoming something longer, colder, and far more unforgiving than any plan imagined in Berlin. In the next chapter, the German advance will press deeper into the Soviet interior, and the first great choices, Leningrad, Kiev, Moscow, will begin to pull at the edges of Hitler's strategy, even as the Soviet people learn what occupation truly means. The crucible of Smolensk. Early July 1941 arrived over a front already too wide for any map. After the Minsk pockets, Army Group Center surged east as if nothing could slow it. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group raced in the south, Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group in the north. Their orders were simple: cross the Dnieper and western Dvina, then swing inward behind the next Soviet line. The planners in Berlin still believed the Soviet Union would crumble in one continuous summer drive. But the rhythm of the war was changing. The Red Army was no longer merely dissolving. Units that escaped Belarus regrouped behind rivers and in forests. Stavka hurled fresh armies into place. Poorly equipped, short on radios, sometimes short on rifles, but present. Soviet commanders understood one thing with clarity. Every day they held west of Moscow was a day that factories could move east and new divisions could form. On July 10th, the battle for Smolensk began. German armor forced river crossings under fire, Luftwaffe bombers pounding bridges and road knots. Hoth took Vitebsk to the north. Guderian drove through Orsha and Mogilev to the south. The pincer arms bent inward, meeting east of Smolensk and trapping large Soviet forces in what Germans called the cauldron. Inside that ring, the Soviets fought like men who had nowhere else to go. Instead of surrendering en masse, many units fragmented and clawed for escape. Night breakouts slipped through swamp and pine. Daylight assaults went in with bayonets and grenades. German infantry divisions, still marching up from the west, had to hold thin lines against repeated counterattacks. For weeks, the pocket did not close cleanly. It throbbed, leaking men and bleeding both sides. The geography around Smolensk mattered. The city sat astride the old invasion highway from Napoleon's day, a node of roads and railways that fed Moscow. Thick forests and broken river lines made maneuver harder than in the open plains of Belarus, giving Soviet troops places to hide and stage counterblows. In villages and river crossings nearby, each bridge became a small world of terror. German engineers rolled pontoons into the water while Soviet guns, often firing from camouflaged edges of woodland, tried to smash them before they settled. Whole battalions were pulled into these fights, not over grand strategy, but over a few planks of timber spanning cold water. Soviet resistance also took a new kind of shape. Commanders who had survived June learned to avoid the rigid, easily encircled fronts of the border battles. They used hedgehog defenses, clusters of strongpoints that forced the panzers to slow or detour, and then struck those detours with artillery and tanks when fuel ran thin. The Soviet Air Force was battered, yet it reappeared in sudden swarms over river crossings, losing planes but forcing German columns to scatter and delay. Even small things mattered. A minefield late at night, a railroad switch sabotaged by a handful of men, a forest ambush that cost the Germans an hour. The Red Army was still being outmaneuvered, but it was learning how to turn its own suffering into friction for the invader. Losses were staggering. The Soviets suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties and prisoners in successive encirclements, while German panzer and infantry units took far heavier losses than in June. Tanks wore out after continuous movement. Engines overheated, tracks snapped, transmissions failed. Recovery crews cannibalized wrecks in roadside workshops. The men were exhausted too. Letters home that had once bragged about speed began to talk about forests full of enemies and roads that never seemed to end. The German army, meanwhile, discovered the limits of its own momentum. Supplies had to travel from railheads far to the west, over roads turning to powder in July heat and to paste after each downpour. Fuel trucks often arrived hours, even days, late. Panzer crews slept beside their vehicles, waking to find no gasoline to move and no spare parts to fix the failures that piled up. Infantry divisions marched brutal distances to keep up with armor, then fought at night against Soviet breakout groups that seemed to rise from the dark itself. The Wehrmacht was still winning, but it was no longer floating forward on effortless speed. It was grinding. Soviet high command counterpunched again and again. Timoshenko hurled armies at the shoulders of the encirclement, trying to tear it open. Near Yelnya, a Soviet attack finally squeezed out a German salient by early September. One of the first local Soviet successes and a hint that the Red Army was learning how to fight this war. It cost terribly, but it bought time, and time was the currency Moscow needed most. In the Soviet rear, that time was being spent with frantic purpose. Newspapers did not dwell on Smolensk's losses. They spoke of stubborn defense and heroic counterattacks. Behind those phrases, the practical response was real. Stalin authorized more emergency mobilizations. Cadres were pulled from training units and sent west. Engineers mined roads and built fallback lines on the Mozhaisk axis. The state's evacuation orders accelerated. Whole plants, from the western cities, presses, lathes, skilled crews and their families, were loaded onto trains for the east. Smolensk was not only a battle, it was a pause long enough for the Soviet system to breathe and harden. In Berlin, Smolensk triggered a fateful argument. The Barbarossa timetable assumed Army Group Center would keep rolling to Moscow, while the North and South dealt with Leningrad and Ukraine. The stubborn resistance around Smolensk unsettled Hitler. He saw Soviet armies still massed near Kiev and feared a strike into his southern flank. He also wanted Leningrad erased as a symbol. Against his general's advice, he ordered the Central Panzers to help finish those objectives first. U2+1. The generals protested. Halder and Bach warned that time mattered more than anything in Russia. Guderian, furious, argued that Moscow was the war's heart. But Hitler's mind was fixed on annihilating Soviet forces wherever they stood and on seizing Ukraine's resources. In the language of ideology, it made sense. In the language of seasons, it was dangerous. While the decision was argued, fighting in the Smolensk region dragged on. Soviet breakout attempts continued into August. Some armies vanished, others escaped in ragged fragments. German infantry clawed through woods full of stragglers, a slow, grinding job that consumed summer weeks. Each delay slid the calendar closer to mud and frost. Hitler had assumed the USSR could be beaten before snow. Smolensk showed that assumption was already fraying. By early September, the cauldron was finally reduced. Smolensk lay in German hands, and the front stood deep in western Russia. The Wehrmacht had smashed the Soviet Western Front and seized the gateway to Moscow. Yet the victory was not the clean, swift cut of earlier blitzkriegs. German spearheads were dulled, supply columns stretched thin, and the enemy they faced had not collapsed, only retreated, reorganized, and grown angrier. By the time the Germans cleared the pocket, they believed they had set the stage for a final sprint to Moscow. Yet they had also lost the smooth, irresistible tempo of early Barbarossa, and that loss would echo through every mile ahead. The human landscape was darker still. Civilians in and around Smolensk entered a second occupation, and Nazi policy left little ambiguity about their fate. Food was seized, forced labor began, villages suspected of resistance were burned, and Einsatzgruppen followed behind the army to murder Jews and Soviet officials in mass shootings. Survivors fled into forests, where fear turned to revenge, and the partisan war deepened. For the Soviets, Smolensk was a tragedy and a lesson. The Red Army had suffered another colossal defeat, but it had delayed the Germans for weeks, revealed that counterattacks could sting, and, most importantly, kept Moscow out of reach through the last bright stretch of summer. New armies were forming behind the capital. Industry was reappearing in the east. Smolensk had purchased that future with blood. For the Germans, the battle left a quieter warning. Victory in Russia could not be separated from distance and time. Every kilometer east multiplied wear on machines and men. Every day of delay invited the weather closer. Smolensk had been won, but at a price the planners had never budgeted. As September opened, Army Group Center's panzers pivoted south toward Ukraine, while to the north German forces pressed on to strangle Leningrad. The hinge at Smolensk slipped behind them into smoke and graves. The road to Moscow was still open, but the season was turning, and the war had learned a slower, harsher pace. The next turns of that German spear, toward Kiev's gigantic pocket and Leningrad's coming starvation, would decide whether Moscow could be reached before winter shut the door. Leningrad, the city that would not starve quietly. The Northern War had its own cadence. Forests, marshes, and lakes narrowed the front, and every road seemed to point to one place: Leningrad. Hitler saw the city as more than a military prize. It was the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, a major armament center, and the great port on the Baltic. To him, its destruction would be a political execution as much as a battlefield victory. In July and August 1941, Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb pushed through the Baltic states and over the old borderlands, aiming for the Neva River and the city beyond. Inside Leningrad, fear arrived before the encirclement did. Almost 3 million civilians were still there, along with garrisons, sailors, and fresh militia. The city's leaders called on everyone to dig. Students, factory workers, and pensioners carved trenches in parks and along boulevards. Anti-tank ditches zigzagged around suburbs. Barricades appeared on avenues named for poets and engineers. Much of the city's industry kept working even as bombs fell, because this was not only a home to defend, but a forge the Red Army still needed. Women welded steel in unheated halls. Teenagers carried sandbags to rooftops. Older men learned to aim anti-aircraft guns with hands that remembered different wars. By late August, the Germans could already shell the outskirts. Food depots burned under Luftwaffe raids. Soon after, Finnish forces advanced from the north to the old 1939 border, and German units from the south and east closed the ring. On September 8, 1941, the final rail line into the city was cut near Schlisselburg. The siege had begun. Leningrad was not to be stormed. Hitler ordered it surrounded, bombed, and starved into silence, refusing to accept surrender terms because he did not want the burden of feeding its people. In his vision of the East, the city was meant to vanish, its population either dead or driven into forced labor, its name erased as thoroughly as its buildings. Rationing started with numbers that sounded survivable, then collapsed week by week. Bread became the measure of life. Workers once received half a kilogram a day, and dependents less, but by November the standard ration for many civilians had fallen to 125 grams. A thin dark slice often padded with cellulose or sawdust to stretch the flour. People stood in lines that hardly moved, holding tins or cloth bags, already faint from hunger, already thinking about how to divide the crumb at home. The city's markets emptied. Meat, dairy, and vegetables disappeared first. Then even substitutes ran out. Soup became hot water with a few shreds of whatever could be found. Children learned to chew slowly, not to waste the feeling of eating. Adults learned to save their strength by speaking less. Then winter came, and it arrived like a second army. The Neva froze, pipes burst, and power stations faltered. With no fuel, apartments turned into iceboxes. Families burned furniture, books, even floorboards for heat. They wrapped windows with rags and paper and slept in coats. The cold made bodies rigid. The hunger made them light. Hospitals filled with the skeletal and feverish. Doctors operated by candlelight, sometimes without anesthesia, sometimes with frozen instruments. The dead were dragged on sleds to cemeteries or to trenches carved in frozen ground. Some buildings became mausoleums of the living and the dead together, because the living no longer had the strength to separate themselves from grief. German artillery settled into a grim daily routine. Shells fell on apartment blocks, hospitals, and tram depots with no distinction between military and civilian targets. Air raids came in waves, often at night, when fires were hardest to fight and panic spread fastest. When one of the city's largest food warehouses burned in September, the smoke hung over Leningrad like an omen. People recalled smelling scorched sugar for days, knowing every plume meant fewer calories for winter. Yet, within this thinning, there was something that did not break. Defense command shifted in September when Stalin sent Georgy Zhukov to stabilize the collapsing lines. He ordered tighter discipline and deeper belts of trenches, and he pushed back German probes that tried to snip the ring tighter. His presence did not make the city warm or full, but it made it harder to crack. In the factories, half-starved workers kept turning out shells, rifles, and the spiked steel hedgehogs that clogged streets. Civilians joined the Narodno Opolsheni, the People's Militia, standing guard with hunting rifles and a few grenades. Anti-aircraft crews fired until their barrels smoked, sometimes on empty stomachs, sometimes with fingers too numb to feel the trigger. The siege also sharpened a quiet war outside the ring. In forests south and east of the city, Soviet partisans formed from escaped soldiers and locals who had fled burning villages. They cut telephone lines, ambushed supply columns, and guided Red Army raids through swamps where German patrols moved slowly. Every derailed train or sabotaged bridge forced the besiegers to divert men from the front to guard rear areas. The occupation policy in the north was as harsh as elsewhere. Suspected helpers were shot on the spot, villages were burned in reprisal, and fear was meant to flow outward like a warning. Leningrad also fought with memory and music. Even in the first winter, libraries stayed open when they could, and theaters gave short performances in freezing halls. The city's cultural life did not erase hunger, but it gave hunger a reason to be endured. The most famous symbol was Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, begun in Leningrad and dedicated to its ordeal, later performed in the besieged city in August 1942. The musicians who survived long enough to play it did so in coats and gloves, their ribs showing beneath fabric, their breath clouding above instruments. The sound went out over radio and loudspeakers, not because it could stop shells, but because it reminded everyone there was still a city worth saving. Still, survival needed food, and only one gate remained cracked open, Lake Ladoga to the east. In summer, barges crept across the water under bombs. In winter, engineers marked a truck route over the ice. It became the road of life. Drivers crossed at night with dim lights, listening for the groan of stressed ice and the whine of aircraft. Shell holes opened like black mouths on the frozen surface. Trucks went through, men went under. Yet they kept coming, bringing flour, medicine, and ammunition, and carrying out the weakest. Children first, then the old. The road never gave enough to end hunger, but it gave enough to keep the city alive. By early 1942, the population had thinned terribly, but the hierarchy of care had changed. Children were evacuated first across Ladoga whenever the road was open, bundled into trucks or boats with tags tied to their coats. The old followed if space existed. Many died on the ice or on arrival, but the effort itself mattered. It told the city that someone beyond the horizon still remembered them. Soldiers on the front received slightly better rations, and even those were meager. Still, these differences kept the defensive line just strong enough to avoid collapse. On the German side, irritation turned to unease. The city did not collapse on schedule, and the siege tied down men and guns that Hitler could have used elsewhere. The Finns, seeking to regain lost territory, halted on the northern approaches and did not join a final assault, leaving the starvation plan largely a German burden. The longer Leningrad lived, the more it became a thorn in the Reich's northern flank. In the long view, the Germans were trying to win by arithmetic. Fewer calories, fewer shells wasted on assault, fewer German casualties. The Soviets answered with something arithmetic could not measure. They answered with endurance, the same endurance that had kept Russia alive through famine and invasion. Leningrad's people did not romanticize their suffering. They simply refused to let it be the last word written about them. The city's survival was not only a moral victory, it was strategic, tying down German divisions year after year, forcing Hitler to spend resources on a siege that would never deliver the quick, symbolic kill he had imagined. So, when we imagine Leningrad in these months, we should imagine both the quiet rooms where families counted crumbs and the loud front where soldiers fired anti-aircraft guns with numb hands. We should imagine an aging pianist practicing scales in gloves because music was still a form of breathing. We should imagine a truck edging over black ice while a driver muttered a prayer he had not said since childhood. In such small scenes, the siege becomes human again. Less a statistic, more a long night. The first winter, 1941-42, was the nadir. Hundreds of thousands died, most from starvation and exposure, and the city's streets became quieter than any enemy had planned. But spring did not bring surrender. It brought thin, stubborn continuation. Soviet forces tried again and again to break the blockade along the Ladoga shore. Early attempts failed, yet each one forced German units to bleed for ground they had hoped to hold cheaply. In the broader war, Leningrad anchored the northern front. keeping pressure away from Moscow and the south at moments when Stalin could not afford another catastrophe. We leave Leningrad still encircled, still breathing through its icy lifeline, while the wider campaign rages toward Moscow and beyond. The Germans had promised themselves a Soviet collapse in weeks. In this city on the Neva, that promise had already died. The siege would endure for nearly 872 days, and the people who survived it would carry its shadow for the rest of their lives. For now, as 1941 closes, Leningrad stands hungry, frozen and unbroken, one of the war's darkest monuments, and one of its clearest proofs that endurance could be stronger than starvation. Chapter 5, The Southern Gate, Crimea and Rostov, Autumn-Winter 1941. While the snow and smoke before Moscow drew the world's attention, another drama was unfolding far to the south, across the open plains of Ukraine and down toward the warm waters of the Black Sea. The German victory at Kiev had shattered the Soviet southwestern front and opened the steppe like a door torn off its hinges. For a moment, the Wehrmacht believed the south would be the place where the Soviet Union truly bled out. In Berlin, maps were studied with a hunger that went beyond tactics. Ukraine meant grain, coal, and railways. Beyond it lay the Donbass industrial heartland, the lower Don River, and at the end of the long road, the Caucasus oil fields that Hitler dreamed of seizing. But the Southern Campaign, like everything in 1941, carried a hidden price. The farther the Germans pushed, the more distance stretched their lifelines thin, and the more the war began to slip from lightning into something slower, colder, and far more dangerous. After Kiev, Army Group South fanned outward. German infantry followed the great rivers, while panzer formations hunted Soviet remnants across the steppe. Kharkov, the massive industrial city of eastern Ukraine, became one early prize. It fell to the Germans in late October 1941 after Soviet forces withdrew under pressure, leaving behind factories already stripped and evacuated eastward. The capture thrilled German commanders. Kharkov was a symbol of industry, of transport, of Soviet modernity. Yet, when they entered, they found not the thriving industrial machine they expected, but hollowed workshops and silent rail yards. Stalin's evacuation policy had turned the city into a shell, denying the Reich the quick economic victory it wanted. Across the countryside, the war for Ukraine had already become a war against civilians. German occupation rules were ruthless and ideological, built on starvation, reprisals, and racial terror. Villages suspected of helping partisans were burned. Entire communities were driven into forced labor or executed. Even in regions the Germans called pacified, hunger followed like a shadow, because food that might have fed towns and farms was requisitioned for the front or shipped west. For the people of the South, liberation had never been on the table, only exploitation and fear. This quiet horror, spreading behind the lines, fed the very partisan movement the Germans most feared. Each new atrocity planted another seed of resistance in the fields and forests. Yet the South was not only a story of occupation, it was also a story of geography, of narrow necks of land, harsh ridgelines, and coastal fortresses. Nowhere would that geography matter more than Crimea. The peninsula was a dagger thrust into the Black Sea, and whoever held it controlled naval routes, airfields, and the maritime flank of the southern front. For Hitler, Crimea offered two temptations at once: strategic safety for the German left wing and a base for future operations toward the Caucasus. For Stalin, it was a vital shield for the industrial South and a symbol of Soviet permanence. So in early autumn 1941, as the rest of the front convulsed, the Germans turned toward the peninsula. Crimea could be entered only through narrow land bridges, the Isthmus of Perekop, and the marshy approaches nearby. Whoever defended those choke points could delay an army for weeks, The Soviets dug in there with desperation, because the alternative was catastrophe. But the German 11th Army, led by Erich von Manstein, had been built for hard, methodical assaults. In September, Manstein drove toward Perekop with heavy artillery, infantry, and air support. The fighting was bitter. The Soviets used trenches, minefields, and the strong natural defenses of the isthmus. Manstein answered with concentrated fire and careful flanking, grinding the lines down step by step. By early October, after fierce combat that left the earth shredded and the defenders exhausted, the Germans broke through the Perekop position and rolled into Crimea. Once inside, the campaign spread like ink on a map. German columns pushed toward Simferopol, Kerch, and the southern coast. Soviet field armies retreated deeper into the peninsula, trapped between the invader and the sea. Sevastopol, the great naval fortress on the southwest tip, became the last anchor. It was not simply a city, it was a layered bastion of concrete, guns, tunnels, and Soviet pride. The Germans understood that Sevastopol would not fall with a quick strike. It would demand siege warfare, the kind of battle that devoured time and men. So by late October 1941, Sevastopol was surrounded, and the long siege began. A slow duel between artillery and stone, between hunger and stubborn survival. Inside Sevastopol, the defenders did what Leningrad's people would do in the north. They learned to live underground. Civilian shelters became command posts and hospitals. Batteries in the cliffs fired day and night, shaking the shoreline. Supplies came in by sea when they could, under constant Luftwaffe attack. Every week that Sevastopol held forced the Germans to keep armies and aircraft tied down, assets Hitler wanted elsewhere. This was the Southern Front's quiet miracle, not a sweeping victory, but a refusal to die quickly. Sevastopol held through the winter, bleeding the 11th Army and complicating the German dream of a clean southern conquest. While Manstein's men fought against stone and sea, another German thrust was pushing east across the steppe toward the Don River. This was the route to Rostov-on-Don, the gate to the Caucasus. Rostov controlled the crossings into the Caucasus and the roads leading toward oil. In the autumn, Hitler's strategic imagination narrowed on that city like a lens. If Rostov fell, the door to the south would swing open. The German 1st Panzer Army under Ewald von Kleist drove for it in November 1941, rolling through terrain that seemed built for armored warfare. Wide plains, long roads, few natural barriers. Soviet defenders were battered and short on reserves after Kiev, but they did not vanish. They delayed, retreated, counterattacked, and bled. By mid-November, Kleist's panzers were reaching Rostov's outskirts. The city was already scarred by air raids, its streets filled with evacuating civilians and grim soldiers preparing for house-to-house resistance. On November 21st, after hard fighting, German units entered Rostov. For a week, Berlin celebrated. Rostov was the farthest point reached by German armies in the south in 1941, and it looked like proof that the Caucasus could be taken next. But the victory lasted only days. The Germans had reached too far with too little. Their supply lines were stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of devastated countryside. Fuel, ammunition, and winter gear were scarce. The troops who entered Rostov were exhausted and exposed, and Soviet command recognized it instantly. Fresh Soviet forces, including the 37th Army, launched a sharp counterattack in late November, striking Kleist's flanks and threatening to encircle his spearheads. Within a week, the German position cracked. On November 29th, Soviet troops retook Rostov, forcing Kleist into a withdrawal westward. It was the first significant German retreat of the entire campaign. Not a planned step back, but a hard shove by an enemy the Germans had declared nearly dead. the meaning of Rostov was larger than the city itself. Militarily, it showed that even in the south, where German maneuver seemed most dangerous, the Wehrmacht could still be stopped and driven back. Strategically, it signaled that the German plan for a seamless 1941 conquest had failed on two fronts at once, before Moscow in the north and at Rostov in the south. Psychologically, the retreat was a shock to German soldiers and commanders who had lived on a diet of ceaseless advance since June. The Wehrmacht's aura had relied on forward movement, on the belief that once it started rolling, it never rolled back. Now that myth cracked in the frost air outside Rostov. For the Soviets, Rostov felt like a breath after months underwater. The Red Army had survived Kiev, survived the road to Moscow, and now had thrown the Germans back from the southern gate. Soviet newspapers trumpeted the victory as proof that the invader could be beaten in open battle, not only frozen into failure by the weather. The retreat was small on a map compared to the vast losses of 1941, but it was enormous in morale. In a war where belief was as valuable as bullets, Rostov gave the South something it had lacked since summer: hope with teeth. Yet even this victory could not erase the suffering spread across the southern lands. Ukraine, the Donbass, and Crimea were now battlefields and occupation zones at once. The countryside was stripped by requisitions, torn by reprisals, and haunted by the movement of armies. Villages near the front emptied as people fled east, while those trapped under occupation faced a winter of starvation and terror. Partisans grew stronger in the forests and ravines, striking supply lines, derailing trains, and punishing isolated garrisons. The Germans responded with heavier brutality, and each cycle of violence deepened the war's savage logic. The Southern Front was becoming a furnace not just for armies, but for entire societies. By December 1941, the German southern advance was stalled. Rostov had been lost. Sevastopol still held out in the cliffs above the sea. The steppe itself had turned from fast road to frozen trap, and German armies now faced the same enemy that had risen before Moscow: distance, cold, and a Red Army that refused to die on schedule. Hitler had wanted the South to be the finishing blow of 1941, the harvest of Ukraine, the port of Crimea, the gate of Rostov. Instead, the South became another proof that Barbarossa was not a sprint, but a war that would grow longer, darker, and more devouring than anything Germany had prepared for. And so, while the world watched the snows outside Moscow, the southern gate stood half open and half barred. Crimea was bleeding under siege. Rostov had shown that German momentum could reverse. The Soviet Union, still wounded almost beyond comprehension, had found new ways to fight. By holding fortresses, by striking back at overreach, by letting geography and winter do their slow, silent work. The year ended not with Hitler's triumph, but with a front that had stiffened into endurance. In the quiet of those frozen plains, the war was changing shape. The South, like the North, had become a place where dreams of quick victory went to die, and where survival itself was turning into the long, steady engine of Soviet resistance. Winter's reversal and the road away from Moscow. December 1941 closed over the battlefield west of Moscow like a heavy door. Rivers stiffened into ice, forests turned into dark walls against endless white, and the air itself seemed to bite. On paper, the German army still looked formidable, but in the snow you could see how badly it was fraying. Supply columns that had once rolled forward in confident streams were now stalled or broken. Fuel froze in drums. Engines cracked or refused to turn. Horses, the quiet backbone of German transport, fell in drifts beside the road. Men who had lived for months on speed and momentum suddenly found themselves pinned in place by the cold, their strength leaking away without a decisive battle to explain it. The Soviet counteroffensive began on December 5th 1941, not as a single dramatic punch, but as a long shove along a front stretching from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. The Stavka and Georgy Zhukov understood that the Germans were most vulnerable when their machines could no longer maneuver. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, released after Soviet intelligence judged Japan unlikely to strike in 1941, arrived with winter gear, skis, and a confidence the front had not felt since June. At first, the attacks felt to German soldiers like a winter tide. Ski battalions slipped through pine woods at night and appeared at dawn beside supply dumps or road junctions. Artillery pummeled villages that had been turned into German strongpoints. The Red Army did not try to smash straight through everywhere at once. It pressed, probed, and widened each crack it found, making the Germans spend precious strength holding positions that no longer mattered. North of Moscow, the Kalinin front struck hard. Soviet armies pushed toward Klin and Kalinin city, aiming to peel open the German flank. The 3rd Panzer Army there was short of fuel and already immobilized by ice. Klin fell on December 15th and Kalinin the following day. The retreat in that sector was rarely neat. German infantry tried to hold roadblocks in villages, but the cold made digging almost impossible, and Soviet shells shattered houses into splinters and smoke. When a position broke, survivors pulled back through snow-choked lanes, leaving behind weapons they could not carry and wounded comrades they could not save. To the south, a parallel battle unfolded around Tula. Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had tried to swing around Moscow in November. It had been stopped by stubborn defenses and a Soviet city that refused to die quietly. Now, the Red Army counterattacked into his exhausted formations. The Germans could not build proper shelters, could not find enough food, and could not keep vehicles running. Soviet troops retook Alexin, Kaluga, and other towns along the river lines, pushing Guderian back and forcing him to abandon the last hope of a southern hook around the capital. Between these northern and southern blows, the central sector became its own world of attrition. Soviet Western Front armies advanced along the main highways toward Istra, Solnekhnogorsk, and Volokolamsk, fighting for each frozen village and rail station. The Germans still fought well in defense, but their strength had been ground down by months of campaigning. By early January 1942, their forces had been pushed back roughly 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow, leaving the capital beyond immediate reach and breaking the spell of a victory that had seemed only days away. For the Soviets, the advance was not a clean triumph. Losses were high. Men froze in shallow trenches. Marches were done with empty stomachs, and attacks sometimes stalled because shells or bread could not arrive in time. Yet a deeper change was taking place. The Red Army was no longer only surviving. It was learning how to fight the Germans on equal terms, and in winter it could feel the balance beginning to tilt. Stalin wanted more than relief from Moscow. He believed, or chose to believe, that the Germans were collapsing and that winter gave him a chance to destroy Army Group Center. In early January 1942, the Soviets launched the Vyazma strategic offensive, aiming to encircle the German 9th Army near Zhev and thrust through Vyazma, breaking the German position west of Moscow. The plan was bold, and it matched the mood of a country that had just seen the invader retreat. The fighting that followed was some of the harshest of the war. Forests were so dense that armies often fought in fragments, separated by only a few kilometers but unable to support one another. Soviet units advanced with fierce courage, sometimes without enough radios or supplies to coordinate properly. They would break into a village with bayonets and grenades, only to find the Germans dug into cellars and haylofts, turning every hut into a bunker. A day's gain might be a mile of snow-covered road. A day's loss might be a regiment erased in a white blur of artillery fire. Hitler's decisions mattered as much as anyone's. He refused to accept the need for withdrawal and ordered his troops to stand fast, to hold every position even if it meant dying there. The no-retreat orders stabilized some parts of the front, but they also chained German divisions to ground they could no longer afford. Soldiers obeyed, freezing in place, because disobedience could mean court-martial or worse. That rigidity saved lines in the short term and bled the army in the long term. The Vyazma offensive achieved only partial success. Soviet armies penetrated deep in places, and airborne units were dropped behind German lines to sow confusion. But the Germans did not disintegrate. They fought stubbornly, supplied isolated pockets by air on clear days, and counterattacked whenever Soviet spearheads outran their support. When the Soviets could not complete the encirclement, a large German bulge west of Moscow remained, the beginning of what would be known as the Rzhev salient. A frozen dagger pointed toward the Soviet capital. Far behind these lines, another kind of war was tightening. Partisan groups in occupied regions were becoming more coordinated. Railways carrying food and ammunition to the front were sabotaged again and again. Bridges were burned. Telephone lines were cut. Small German garrisons in the rear slept lightly, knowing that a forest nearby could suddenly open into gunfire. The Red Army depended on this shadow war to keep German supplies thin, and Stalin's government increasingly treated partisans as a strategic partner rather than a desperate improvisation. Across the broader Eastern Front, winter was rewriting expectations. Leningrad remained under siege, starving yet unbroken, and Soviet attempts to open a corridor toward the city were still too weak to finish the job. In Crimea, Sevastopol held on, with German and Romanian forces preparing for renewed assaults. Along the southern shoulder of the front, both sides were exhausted, but neither was ready to stop. The war was no longer a single rush of movement. It was settling into hard, grinding seasons. Inside Moscow, the mood shifted from terrified vigilance to exhausted relief. The city still lived on rations and blackouts. Bombed districts still smoked. Yet people could believe that German tanks would not roll down their streets tomorrow. The parade on Red Square in November had been defiance. The winter counteroffensive was proof that defiance could push back. For ordinary soldiers, the retreat felt like stepping back through their own past. In summer, they had marched east under bright skies, certain that the campaign was nearly finished. Now they moved west in silence, leaving behind guns frozen into the ground and comrades wrapped in blankets on sledges. Many wrote later that this was the moment they understood Russia was not another France or Poland. It was a war that ate time, strength, and certainty. For Soviet soldiers, the same snow carried a different meaning. Each mile gained in winter felt like a repayment for months of humiliation, and a promise that the land could be reclaimed. In Germany, the retreat was a shock that propaganda could only partly hide. The public heard phrases about shortening the line and saving strength for spring, while letters from the front spoke of cold beyond imagining. In occupied Europe, resistance movements listened carefully. If the Germans could be pushed back in Russia, they could be challenged elsewhere too. The aura of invincibility, so important to Nazi control, had cracked on the ice before Moscow. Nothing about this winter meant the end of the struggle. Soviet commanders, flushed with success, sometimes overreached. Their armies were not yet supplied for deep advances. German troops, though battered, were still capable, and in many places they turned retreat into a new defense with cruel efficiency. What the winter decided was direction. Germany could still fight fiercely, but it could not win quickly. The Soviet Union could still bleed terribly, but it would not fall quickly either. By the end of January 1942, the German army had survived Moscow's winter blow, but only by yielding ground and paying a price it could never fully repay. The Soviet Union had survived the first storm of Barbarossa and had struck back hard enough to change the war's direction. Between Zhev's frozen woods and the distant spires of Moscow, the Eastern Front slipped into its long, brutal middle chapter, one that would demand new armies, new sacrifices, and new illusions from both sides, spring traps and summer dreams. Winter loosened its grip on the forests outside Moscow, but it left both armies battered, clogged with dead metal and exhausted men. The Soviet counteroffensive had saved the capital and pushed the Germans back, yet it hadn't destroyed them. Instead, it created a strange, unsettled spring. Across the front, soldiers stared at melting snow and wondered whether the pause meant relief or only a new kind of peril. For the Red Army, the months after Moscow were a time of bruised pride and fierce impatience. The state had survived the storm of 1941. The people had endured hunger, bombardment, evacuation, and terror. And now, with the invader pushed away from the Kremlin's spires, a dangerous thought began to spread through Soviet headquarters. Maybe the Germans were finally cracking for good. The map in Stalin's hands still looked terrifying. Vast portions of the Soviet Union were occupied, millions of citizens were under Nazi rule, and entire armies had been erased the previous year. But the one great victory outside Moscow whispered a promise. If the enemy could be beaten in winter, perhaps he could be beaten in spring and finished by summer. It was the kind of hope that can lift a nation and mislead it at the same time. On the German side, hope also lived. Different in flavor, but just as stubborn. The retreat from Moscow had shocked the Wehrmacht. It had shocked Hitler even more. Yet to him, the failure was not a sign that the war was unwinnable. It was a sign that the war had been mismanaged and that Germany needed a sharper, more ruthless path to victory. The Germans had lost the chance to end the war quickly, so Hitler chose a new answer. Not another broad drive on Moscow, but a focused strike in the south, toward the resources he believed could choke the Soviet state at its roots. Ukraine had bread, the Donbass had coal, the Caucasus had oil. If those could be seized, Hitler thought the Soviet Union would bleed out, even if Moscow stood. This was the seed of the campaign that would soon be called Case Blue. But before that new summer dream could unfold, spring demanded its price. The thaw came early and turned roads into brown rivers. Trucks sank to their hubs. Horses struggled in mud that clung like wet cement. The Rasputitsa did not stop the war entirely, but it slowed movement enough that both sides began to reorganize, to plan, to argue. In Soviet command tents, a different kind of pressure took hold. Stalin wanted proof that Moscow was not a lucky stand, but the beginning of a great reversal. He wanted offensives. He wanted enemy pockets. He wanted the kind of bold strokes that had once carried the Red Army westward after the revolution. His generals, especially those who had grown in confidence during the winter battles, were eager to believe it was possible. In the south, near the battered city of Kharkov, Soviet forces sat in a bulge on the west bank of the Seversky Donets River. It was a tempting position. From there, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko and his staff believed they could strike toward Kharkov and then perhaps drive even farther, reclaiming Ukraine's industrial heart. The offensive began on May 12, 1942. For a few bright days, it seemed like the dream of spring victory was real. Soviet armies pushed forward, and German lines wavered. But beneath that advance lay the quiet weaknesses of a still recovering army. Communications were shaky, air cover was thin, supplies were uncertain, and worst of all, Soviet command underestimated how quickly the Germans could respond. As the Soviet spearheads pressed ahead, German aircraft hammered them from above, and German armor gathered on the flanks like wolves circling a herd. On May 17th, the German counterstroke came down in a pincer. Within days, 3 Soviet field armies were cut off inside what the Germans called Operation Friedrichsruh. The pocket tightened. Artillery thundered. The Luftwaffe dropped thousands of tons of bombs into the trapped mass. Inside the Encirclement, men fought as Soviet soldiers often did in 1942, fiercely, stubbornly, but with too little coordination to break free. Breakout attempts were shredded. Ammunition dwindled. Wounded men lay in fields and ravines as spring rains soaked through their uniforms. By the time resistance collapsed, roughly 250,000 Soviet troops had been trapped, and Soviet casualties reached about 280,000. A disaster measured not just in numbers but in the loss of momentum and confidence. The Second Battle of Kharkov was a cruel lesson. Moscow had not meant the Germans were finished. It meant the Germans had been slowed. The Red Army had survived, but it was still learning how to strike without exposing its ribs. For Stalin, the defeat was infuriating, and yet he could not pause long in anger. The front did not allow mourning. While Soviet forces reeled, the Germans moved to close another chapter they had left unfinished in Crimea. Ever since the previous year, Sevastopol had held out like a stone in the Black Sea. The city was a fortress of cliffs, tunnels, coastal batteries, and desperate sailors. Its defenders had endured bombardment, starvation, and repeated assaults. To the Soviets, Sevastopol was a symbol. As long as it lived, the Black Sea Fleet had a home, and the German south flank remained unsettled. To Hitler, it was a thorn that had to be pulled before the grand summer push could begin. In June 1942, Manstein's 11th Army and Romanian units began the final assault, codenamed Sturfang. The preparations were immense. Hundreds of thousands of Axis troops and over 1,000 guns were brought to bear. The Luftwaffe turned the skies above Sevastopol into a furnace, flying thousands of sorties and dropping vast tonnage to pulverize Soviet positions. Day after day, the earth shook. Fortifications that had survived since the Tsars were cracked open by modern explosives. Naval batteries fired until their barrels glowed. Soldiers fought in caves, trenches, ruined streets. But siege warfare is a form of time, and time was on Germany's side here. By early July, Sevastopol fell. Tens of thousands were captured. Many more died in the last defenses or trying to escape by sea. The Axis victory allowed Hitler to declare Crimea secured and freed Manstein's forces for future use. To Soviet citizens listening on radios far from the Black Sea, these losses were heavy and frightening. Kharkov had been a spring gamble that ended in a trap. Sevastopol had been a long, heroic stand that ended in silence. Yet, even through these blows, the Soviet war machine did not collapse. New divisions were still forming. Factories beyond the Urals continued to spit out tanks and guns. The Red Army had learned to retreat, to survive winter, and now, painfully, to respect German skill even after German setbacks. The war had become a grinding organism with two hearts that refused to stop beating. Meanwhile, in German headquarters, confidence surged again. Hitler read Kharkov and Sevastopol not as local victories, but as proof that the Wehrmacht could still destroy Soviet armies in the field. The very scale of Soviet losses fed his belief that another decisive summer was possible. His generals worried about the state of their troops. Many divisions were under strength, equipment was worn, and the winter retreat had scarred morale. But Hitler's focus had narrowed to a vision that seemed, in his mind, almost simple. The South would be the answer. Case Blue was set for late June. Its aim was to smash Soviet forces in the southern sector and seize the economic lifelines of the USSR, the oil fields of the Caucasus, and control of the Volga River. Hitler believed that if the Soviet Union lost those resources, it would be unable to fuel its tanks, feed its cities, or supply its armies. The plan concentrated German armor and air power on Army Group South, and then split it into Army Group A and B, one to drive toward the Caucasus, the other toward the Volga and Stalingrad. From a cold strategic angle, the plan had logic. Germany needed oil desperately. The Soviet Union depended on it just as much. But plans on paper never carry the mud, the dust, or the stubborn will of people who have already survived annihilation once. Case Blue carried within it a confidence that the Soviet Union was nearly exhausted. Kharkov reinforced that belief. Yet the Soviets, despite their wounds, were not empty. They were bruised iron still being hammered into shape. In Soviet command circles, the mood after Kharkov was bitter but not hopeless. Zhukov and others argued that Germany was preparing a southern thrust, and they tried to reinforce the sector with fresh armies. But the Soviet front line was enormous, a guard stretched across a continent. Every reinforcement to the south meant weakness elsewhere. Every tank sent to the Don Steppe was a tank not sent to protect the road to Leningrad or the forests of the northwest. Command decisions became a tense balancing act, and the Soviet system, still haunted by fear of Stalin's wrath, often chose to hold too much ground rather than trade space for time. Down in the villages and towns along the southern front, the war's tempo was felt in quieter ways. Crops were planted under the shadow of approaching armies. Women worked the fields alone because husbands and sons were gone. Old men watched the sky for aircraft, not rain. The Red Army units arriving to dig in were a mix of veterans and new recruits, men who still carried the memory of 1941 in their bones. They spoke of Kiev, of Vyazma, of winter trenches outside Moscow. They did not trust easy victories anymore. Yet they believed in survival, and survival had a strength the Germans still underestimated. As June grew hot, German columns began to gather again. Dust replaced snow. The smell of fuel returned to the air. Engines that had refused to start in December now roared. Soldiers who had once stared at Moscow through freezing binoculars were told a new promise. This time, the Red Army would be crushed in the south. The Soviet Union would be starved of oil, and the war would end. Many wanted to believe it. They had marched too far, buried too many friends, to accept that the road might lead only into years of killing. In the steppe, a different kind of quiet settled, a waiting quiet. The land between the Don and the Volga was wide and open, made for armies to move like tides. Soon it would be filled with tanks, artillery, and men clawing for advantage under a harsh sun. The Soviets knew the storm was coming. They could feel it in the rumble beyond the horizon. The Germans were certain this storm would wash their failures away. Spring 1942, then, closed with both sides carrying opposite lessons. The Soviets had learned humility. Victory at Moscow had not ended the war, and reckless offensives could still turn into slaughter. The Germans had learned confidence again. The Red Army could still be trapped, and the South might yet deliver the decisive blow they had missed near Moscow. History was pulling the armies toward a new center of gravity. The map's arrows were bending south. The next chapter would not be written in snowdrifts outside the capital, but in wheat fields, river bends, and an industrial city on the Volga, whose name would soon be spoken in every language on earth. For now, the front held its breath. The red and gray lines stared at each other across the summer dust. And somewhere in that vast space, the future of the war waited, quiet, patient, and terribly awake. Case Blue Unleashed. The summer of 1942 arrived like a door flung open. After the long winter struggle before Moscow and the muddied spring that followed, the land dried and hardened again. Dust rose behind marching boots and rolling tracks. Rivers ran lower. The sky widened into a pale blue dome, promising movement and speed. For the German army, this was the season in which they believed the war would finally be decided. For the Soviet Union, it was the season they feared most, because summer, in the first year of Barbarossa, had belonged to the invader. Hitler's new offensive was called Case Blue, and in his mind it was not simply another operation. It was the correction of history. Moscow had not fallen. Leningrad still lived. The Soviet state, battered, had refused to collapse. But Hitler was convinced the reason was not Soviet strength, it was German misdirection. The war had been aimed at the wrong throat. Now, at last, the Reich would strike where the Soviet body truly bled, the South. The logic went beyond ideology. Germany was starving for oil. Its armies ran on fuel as surely as men ran on bread, and the fuel reserves of the Reich were not enough for a long war against a continent-sized enemy. The Caucasus oil fields, Maikop, Grozny, Baku, glittered in Hitler's imagination like a treasure that could turn exhaustion back into invincibility. At the same time, the Volga River was the Soviet Union's great artery, carrying grain, oil, and weapons from the interior to the front. If Germany could sever it, if it could seize the southern resources and cut the Soviet lifelines, then the Red Army would be forced to fight without blood in its veins. It was a wager on strategy, geography, and desperation. To carry out that wager, Army Group South received the bulk of Germany's remaining offensive power. It was still formidable. Panzers repaired after winter, infantry divisions refitted, Luftwaffe air fleets shifted south, and new allies brought in. Yet the army was no longer the sleek weapon of June 1941. It was scarred. Divisions were under strength, trucks were worn, horses were thin. The fighting of the previous year had burned away a deep layer of veteran strength, and replacement troops, young or hastily trained, stepped into ranks that had once been filled with hardened men. Still, the German command believed that the South favored them. The terrain was open, ideal for armored thrusts. Soviet forces there had been weakened by Kharkov. The path seemed ready. On 28 June 1942, Case Blue began. It did not open with a slow-shaping fight, but with the blunt certainty of a claw strike. German armor poured forward near Kursk and Belgorod, smashing through Soviet positions that were too thin to absorb such pressure. The Red Army fought, often bravely, but it was caught in the wrong posture. Many Soviet commanders still believed the main German blow would return toward Moscow. Their reserves were not where the storm landed, and the Soviet lines in the south were a patchwork of armies still rebuilding after spring disasters. The German spearheads exploited that weakness in the way they had always known how to do, by moving faster than fear. In the first days, entire Soviet formations were outflanked. The Germans bypassed strong points, leaving infantry to reduce them later, while panzers drove eastward toward the Don River. Air power played an equally brutal role. The Luftwaffe, freed from many of the constraints it had experienced in winter, returned to dominance over the open steppe. Soviet supply columns were bombed. Railroad junctions were shattered. Troops retreating across flat fields were punished in full daylight. Death, in this landscape, could come from nowhere but the sky. Soviet defensives bent, then broke in places. Retreat orders were issued, but they came too late for some armies. The same nightmare that had visited the Soviets in 1941 began to revisit them in 1942, pockets forming, panic spreading, roads filling with half-organized columns of soldiers and civilians drifting eastward. Yet this time, there was a difference. In 1941, retreat had often been a collapse. In 1942, retreat was a bitter skill that the Red Army had learned. Units fell back in stages. Rearguards fought delaying actions. Commanders tried to keep cohesion even while losing ground. It was not enough to stop the Germans, but it prevented the kind of total disintegration the Wehrmacht had once relied on. As the front swayed east, the war again became inseparable from the lives of civilians. The southern Soviet lands were thick with villages and farms, with fields of wheat and sunflowers, and in those weeks they became corridors of movement and terror. Families loaded carts with what they could carry. Old women pulled children by the hand, leaving houses half empty, doors swinging open so the wind could pass through rooms that might soon burn. Roads clogged with livestock, bicycles, broken trucks, and frightened people moving toward an uncertain interior. The Soviet state had ordered evacuations, but evacuation on paper and evacuation under bombs are not the same thing. Many did not escape. Many had nowhere to go but the shallow cellars of their own homes. Behind the retreating Red Army, the Germans advanced into occupied territory again, and occupation carried its own machinery of cruelty. The South was not merely a battlefield in Hitler's plan. It was a future colony. German units followed orders to seize grain, to requisition supplies, to use local labor. The ideology of Lebensraum did not soften because the Wehrmacht needed speed. It traveled with them, like a shadow. Jews were hunted and shot. Suspected partisans were executed. Villages that resisted too much were burned as warnings. Even for those who survived, occupation meant hunger never far away, because Nazi policy treated Soviet territory as something to be drained, not governed. In Berlin and at Hitler's headquarters, maps showed arrows leaping forward across Ukraine toward the dawn. The pace of the advance thrilled Hitler. It seemed to confirm everything he wanted to believe. Within weeks, German forces captured Voronezh and reached the great curve of the Don River, and then, in one of those decisions that would seem small in the moment and enormous later, Hitler altered the plan. Originally, Case Blue envisioned a strong push to the Don, then a turn southeast towards Stalingrad to secure the Volga before committing fully to the Caucasus. But as the offensive unfolded, Hitler's obsession with oil grew. He split Army Group South into two separate forces: Army Group A to drive deep into the Caucasus, and Army Group B to take Stalingrad and protect the northern flank along the Don and Volga. On paper, it looked like a grand double sweep. In reality, it stretched German power across two hungry distances at once. Many German generals protested. They saw the danger. The Wehrmacht no longer had the strength of 1941. Splitting its spearhead meant neither thrust would have the weight to crush the Soviets completely. Supply lines already ran long over crumbling roads and overheated engines. The South had few railways, and each kilometer of conquest demanded fuel to sustain it. Germany's greatest enemy in Russia had always been space. By dividing force, Hitler was asking his armies to conquer space twice over, but Hitler's will had hardened after Moscow. He trusted his own instinct more than professional advice. He believed the Soviets were near collapse, and that any risk was justified if it seized the prizes he wanted. So the split happened, and with it the invisible hinge of the campaign began to creak. Southward, Army Group A surged into the Caucasus. The landscape changed from steppe to rolling hills, from wheat fields to mountain shadows. The German advance toward Maykop and later toward Grozny seemed almost like a march into a different world. Panzers wound through valleys. Infantry climbed ridges. The Luftwaffe flew far from its bases, growing thinner the deeper the columns went. For many German soldiers, the Caucasus felt like the edge of the earth. They spoke of its heat, its strange peaks, its endless horizon. Some believed they were walking into the oil that would fuel victory. They reached Maykop in August and found a bitter surprise. The Soviet scorched earth policy, which had been so vicious in 1941, returned here with equal ruthlessness. The oil installations were sabotaged and burned. Wells were fouled. Machinery smashed. The Germans found the prize ruined, at least temporarily. Repairing it would take time, specialists, equipment, peace. None of those things belonged on an active front. Still, Hitler urged his men deeper. Even a damaged oil field was better than none. He wanted Baku. He wanted the sea of oil beyond the mountains. And so, Army Group A pressed on, farther and farther from its supplies. Northward, Army Group B drove toward a city that was not, in itself, a resource. Stalingrad was an industrial hub on the Volga, but its deeper value, at least to Hitler, was symbolic and strategic. If it was taken, the Volga could be savored. Soviet transport could be strangled. The northern flank of the Caucasus Drive could be held. And there was one more truth beneath all of that. The city bore Stalin's name. Hitler's mind, always prone to ideological drama, saw Stalingrad as a talisman. Capture it, and you humiliate Stalin before the world. Capture it, and you shatter Soviet morale. Capture it, and perhaps the Soviet state begins to unravel from within. Soviet High Command watched these movements with mounting alarm. The scale of the advance was enormous. The Germans had crossed hundreds of kilometers in weeks, and their momentum seemed unstoppable again. Yet Soviet intelligence began to understand the new shape of the German plan. The push was not toward Moscow. It was toward the south and southeast. Stalin ordered defenses strengthened along the Don and Volga. Fresh armies, still forming and not always properly equipped, were rushed into the path of Army Group B. The Red Army did not have the luxury of choosing perfect positions. It had to block the road with what it could gather. In July and August, the battle for the Don Basin became a fierce series of clashes. Soviet troops tried to hold river lines, to delay crossings, to bleed the panzers. German forces, aided by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units on their flanks, pushed through. The Don itself was not a fortress. It was a barrier, yes, but it could be forced by determined attackers with air support and engineering skill. The Germans crossed it in several places, and each crossing widened the danger to Stalingrad. As the front moved toward the Volga, the sky filled with a different kind of fear. Luftwaffe raids escalated, hammering towns and industrial districts along the river. In Stalingrad itself, civilians watched trains roll in carrying wounded men and out carrying machinery. The city was already half at war before the Germans reached its gates. Factories worked day and night, producing tanks and shells even as the front drew near. Women welded armor plates coated in oil and sweat. Children carried messages, moved sandbags, leaned into the labor of a society that had no choice but to spend itself for survival. For Soviet soldiers arriving in the Stalingrad sector, the ground felt like a wall they had to become. Many were young conscripts. Many were survivors from past encirclements. Some were sailors from the Volga flotilla, soldiers of every kind thrown into the same desperate line. Behind them lay the Volga and the city. Behind the city lay the interior of the Soviet Union. Retreat meant not only losing Stalingrad, but opening the way to the heartland. Stalin understood this and issued the order that would soon be famous: not one step back. It was a command that mixed necessity, rage, and fear. Its enforcement was brutal. NKVD blocking detachments stood behind lines to stop panic and flight. But even without them, Soviet troops knew what the Germans had done to cities they captured. The war in the East was not gentle enough to allow surrender. On 23 August 1942, German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. That day, the Luftwaffe unleashed a bombing raid that turned huge sections of the city into fire. Factories burned. Wooden neighborhoods vanished in smoke. Thousands died. The Volga was choked with debris and bodies, and the air smelled of fuel and scorched earth. To German commanders, the raid was meant to finish the job before street fighting began. They believed a city so smashed could not resist long. To the Soviets, the ruins became a kind of armor. A shattered city was harder to conquer with tanks than a living one. Rubble created cover. Broken walls became fortresses. Cellars became firing points. The bombing had killed civilians, yes, but it also prepared the ground for a battle that would favor the defenders' stubborn grip. Still, in late summer, none of that future was visible yet. Case Blue was still unfolding like a tide that seemed to rise without end. The Germans held the initiative. Their flags stood on the Don in Crimea, deep in the Caucasus, at the edge of the Volga. It looked to many observers like the Soviet Union was being carved open from the south. Yet beneath that surface lay the strain of distance, the thinning of supply, the danger of overreach. Army Group A was far in the mountains, hungry for oil it could not yet pump. Army Group B was approaching a city that was not collapsing as expected. Its flanks were guarded by allies whose strength was real but limited. German fuel stocks were still fragile, and their railways struggled to keep up with a front that moved faster than steel could be laid. The war was repeating itself and changing at once. In 1941, the Germans had surged and the Soviets had staggered. In 1942, the Germans surged again, and the Soviets staggered again, but with a deeper understanding of what staggering could lead to and how to endure it. The Soviet Union in 1942 no longer expected salvation from quick victory. It expected to survive, to absorb, to wait for the moment when German momentum would finally slip. Stalingrad, now looming ahead like a black silhouette on the Volga, was becoming the place where that waiting might become a trap. Summer in the east can feel endless. The days are long, the light is harsh, the land is open. But in war, summer is also a candle that burns down faster than men realize. By late August, the flame of Case Blue was still bright, yet its base was beginning to thin. The Germans believed they were about to win the war in the south. The Soviets believed they were about to fight a battle they could not afford to lose. At the Volga's bend, the city of Stalingrad was turning from a name on a map into a destiny. And as the two great thrusts of Case Blue pulled Germany farther and farther apart, the Soviet command prepared to hold and then to strike. The road to the Caucasus had become a long, hungry desire. The road to Stalingrad had become a narrow, deadly corridor. Somewhere between them, the war in the east was preparing to change its face once more. Stalingrad's first inferno. Stalingrad did not rise like a fortress from the earth. It was a city stretched along a river, long and narrow, built more for industry than for defense. Before the war, its smokestacks had poured their breath over the Volga, while its factories forged tractors and steel. Its streets were plain, its neighborhoods a patchwork of workers' blocks, small wooden houses, and wide industrial zones. It was not beautiful in the way Petrograd or Moscow were beautiful. It was a city of labor and grit. And now, by late August 1942, it had become the hinge of everything. When the Germans reached the Volga's bend, they expected Stalingrad to be another Kharkov, another huge city that would collapse under fire and fear. Their air power had already done what air power always hoped to do: transform a living place into a broken one. The raids of August 23rd were among the most destructive a city had endured in the war. Flames ran through whole districts, especially the wooden quarters near the river. People who survived described the air itself burning, as if the sky had fallen into the streets. The Volga reflected the fire like a second city of red light. Families fled toward the embankments under a rain of bombs, crowding into boats and barges that rocked under the weight of panic. Many never made it across. Some died in the streets. some drowned when bomb shocks flipped craft into the river. The books and papers of daily life, letters, school notebooks, factory records, turned to ash in the wind. Yet the idea that bombing would finish Stalingrad was an illusion. The city had been ruined, but it had not been emptied. Tens of thousands of civilians remained inside. Some could not leave, some would not leave, some were ordered to stay because factories still worked and because the front needed hands to dig and carry. The Soviet state believed a city could defend itself not only with soldiers, but with people who refused to abandon it. So Stalingrad, half-charred and choking with smoke, prepared to fight with what remained. The Volga was now the boundary between life and death. On its eastern bank, Soviet supply depots, hospitals, and reserve camps formed a nervous spine of defense. On its western bank, the city itself lay in the crosshairs. Every boat that crossed the river after late August carried something that mattered: ammunition, bread, wounded men, more soldiers. Every boat also carried the risk of not returning. German artillery had positions north and west that could reach parts of the river, and the Luftwaffe hunted ferry routes whenever weather allowed. But the Volga was wide, and it was Soviet-controlled. That meant Stalingrad could be fed, however thinly. Unlike Leningrad, it was not sealed into slow starvation. It was in a different kind of siege, a siege measured in rubble, fire, and bodies. For the German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus, Stalingrad was not only a military objective but a project of honor. The city had resisted bombing. It had refused to panic into surrender. Now it would be taken by assault. Paulus' army was large but already tired from the long advance across the Don and steppe. His men had marched and fought for weeks under heat and dust. Their supply lines ran back across a land that had little to offer and much to drain. Yet they still believed that once the city was entered, Soviet defenses would degrade into chaos. The Germans had seen the Red Army retreat from city to city in 1941 and early 1942. They expected the same. They did not understand what Stalingrad meant to the Soviet command. It was not just a place to delay, it was a place to anchor the war. If Stalingrad fell cleanly, the Volga would be cut. The Caucasus Drive would be protected. The southern campaign might still succeed in spite of the split fronts. Soviet leadership knew this. Stalin knew this. And so, Stalingrad became a point of stubbornness, as absolute as Moscow had been a year earlier. Marshal Georgy Zhukov remained the overall architect, but the defense of Stalingrad fell heavily to General Andrei Yeremenko of the Stalingrad Front and to Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, who would soon take command of the city's core defense. Their task was brutal in its simplicity. Hold the city, hold the riverbank, hold whatever you can hold for as long as you can hold it. There was no graceful strategy available. The Germans were too close. The numbers were too lopsided. The city was too broken already. The defense would be an act of grinding will. Soviet reinforcements arrived in waves. Some were veteran formations. Many were green. The Volga ferries carried them under fire. And often, the first thing they saw of the city was smoke and shattered skyline. When they stepped off boats into the soot of the western bank, they were marched immediately into the blinding roar near the northern factories, or into the broken districts near Mamayev Kurgan, the low hill that overlooked much of Stalingrad. Mamayev Kurgan would become one of the deadliest patches of ground on Earth. But in early September, it was still a hill in a city under assault, and its possession meant visibility, artillery observation, and a psychological high ground. The German assault began in earnest in late August and deepened through September. Their method was direct: break in from the west, split the city, drive the Soviets into the river. The Sixth Army advanced with tanks and infantry in close coordination. German artillery pummeled known Soviet positions. Air raids struck factories and railway depots again and again. On the edge of Stalingrad, the Germans moved into suburbs and outer districts, seizing block by block, pushing toward the heart. The Soviet defense did not collapse, but it did retreat into the city itself. Zhukov's famous principle would emerge: cling to the enemy. Keep the line so close that German air power and artillery could not be used freely without hitting their own troops. If Germans tried to mass, Soviet units would strike at close range. If Germans pulled back to fire, Soviets would creep forward. It was a desperate way to fight, because it meant living almost within shouting distance of the attackers, but it was the only way to blunt a force that had superior firepower and air support. Over time, this method would be called hugging the enemy, but in those first days, it was less a doctrine and more a survival reflex. The city itself transformed into something inhuman. Streets lost their names in practice. Instead, places became known by what had happened there, not by what they once were. A grain elevator near the southern districts became a fortress because Soviet troops held it for days against constant German assault. The tractor factory, the Red October steelworks, and the Barricadi gun factory in the north became whole battlefields of metal, smoke, and rubble. Tanks were repaired inside factory halls and driven straight into combat through broken walls. Workers, often half-starved and exhausted, continued producing shells while German shells fell outside. Stalingrad's industrial zones were not behind the war, they were part of it. The Germans, entering this environment, found it alien. Blitzkrieg had depended on speed, open ground, and shock. In Stalingrad, speed was devoured by debris. Open ground was scarce. Shock was muted because the defenders were already living inside shock. Tanks could not roll through streets clogged with rubble without exposing themselves to close-range attacks. Buildings that should have been destroyed by bombs still stood in jagged fragments, and those fragments were perfect cover for Soviet machine gunners and snipers. Every cellar could hide a squad. Every shattered wall could conceal an anti-tank rifle. The city was a maze of death where advantage shifted by the hour. Soviet troops improvised defenses at every scale. They mined stairwells and doorways. They collapsed walls between adjacent buildings so soldiers could move through interiors without stepping into streets. They used sewers and trenches to thread their way behind German lines. Houses were fortified into small castles. A single apartment block could hold out against repeated attacks because the defenders had sighted machine guns on each floor and had pre-aimed grenades down hallways. German infantry, trained for aggressive assaults, now had to clear buildings room by room under constant risk of sudden fire. The simplest task, crossing a courtyard, became a mission with its own casualties. As September advanced, the battle took on a rhythm that felt both relentless and oddly intimate. It was no longer two armies facing across a line of open land. It was thousands of tiny battles inside a single city. Squads fought for control of floors, basements, stairwells, and roofs. Sometimes a staircase belonged to Germans by day and to Soviets by night. Sometimes a wall separated men who could hear one another breathe. At times, fighting was so close that grenades were thrown across rooms rather than across streets. Bayonets, shovels, and pistols mattered as much as rifles. The air was thick with dust from collapsing concrete, and with the sour smell of burnt oil, blood, and unburied bodies. Civilians remained caught in the middle. Some sheltered in basements for weeks, emerging only to search for water in the half-destroyed city and to scavenge bread when possible. Others formed labor detachments to carry ammunition, dig trenches, or help evacuate wounded. children became messengers or water carriers. Old people lingered in shelters long after their homes had vanished. The Soviet command tried to evacuate as many as possible across the Volga, but the crossings were deadly. Many stayed because leaving meant stepping into more danger than staying. In some districts, the presence of civilians hardened Soviet troops. This was not an abstract line on a map. This was a city where people still lived. The Germans did not always understand that. Their occupation policy elsewhere had destroyed any chance of civilian neutrality. In Stalingrad, nobody expected mercy if the city fell. That expectation fueled a kind of quiet, fierce endurance among defenders and inhabitants alike. The Germans pushed hard toward the Volga in September. Their objective was to cut the Soviet defense into isolated pockets and to seize the riverbank so that supplies could no longer cross. In some places, they succeeded. By mid-September, they reached the river in several narrow corridors, particularly in the central districts. This meant Soviet defenders were now fighting with the Volga behind them, sometimes only a few hundred meters away. It also meant the city was partially split. Zhukov's 62nd Army was often fractured into separate groups, each clinging to a zone of ruins, connected more by radio and night movement than by continuous lines. In a different war, this might have been fatal. In Stalingrad, fragmentation was the normal condition. At Mamayev Kurgan, the hill changed hands repeatedly. German infantry stormed it. Soviet infantry counterattacked. Artillery churned the soil until it resembled a plowed field of bone and iron. The hillside became pocked with craters and littered with bodies that could not be recovered. The very earth became mixed with metal fragments. Men died there not because it was beautiful ground, but because it dominated the city's core, and because the battle had become a contest of will as much as terrain. Whoever held Mamayev Kurgan could see into Stalingrad. Whoever lost it felt blind. So they fought for it over and over, bleeding into a hill that seemed to drink blood without filling. By late September, Paulus believed the Soviet defense was near exhaustion. German maps showed their troops in the city's heart and on certain riverbank points. German intelligence estimated Soviet losses that were staggering. They assumed the enemy was almost out of reserves. In a sense, they were right. The Soviets in the city were terribly strained. Many units were reduced to a fraction of their nominal strength. Ammunition was finite. Food was scarce. Wounded men piled up at makeshift aid stations near the river, waiting for boats that might never come. Yet the Germans misread what exhaustion meant for the Soviets. Exhaustion did not mean collapse. It meant stubbornness stripped to its raw core. Soviet reinforcements continued to cross, even when the ferries were bombed. New battalions arrived at night. Some were thrown into fighting the same day. Losses were immense, but so was the flow of replacements from the east. Stalingrad did not have to be supplied in abundance. It had to be supplied just enough to keep breathing. That was what the Volga allowed. Every night the river carried more life into the ruins. And in those ruins, new legends began to form. Soviet snipers stalked German officers and machine gun positions, turning the rubble into a hunting ground. Vasily Zaitsev would become famous later, but sniper warfare was already emerging as a defining part of the struggle. Germans learned to move cautiously, to avoid open windows, to fear the quiet glint of optics in broken brick. Patrols advanced in bursts rather than in lines. They could not be sure where death waited. The city itself became a school of survival for both sides. October came, but the battle did not soften with the season. Instead, the cooling air carried a deeper chill into the streets. Rains slicked the rubble. Nights grew longer. The Volga began to mist in the mornings, and the smell of wet ash filled the air. The Germans renewed their assaults, concentrating on the northern factories where they believed a final push could drive the Soviets into the river. The fighting there was among the fiercest of the entire battle. The tractor factory was taken and retaken in parts. Barricady and Red October became half-occupied zones, where German and Soviet troops fought in the same workshop halls, separated by walls and piles of scrap metal. There were days when Soviet tanks were assembled under fire and rolled out into combat almost immediately, only to be knocked out within hours. But the act of producing and fighting at once became part of the myth of the city. Stalingrad was not simply defended. It was forged again and again in the furnace of its own factories. German casualties climbed. Their offensive power began to erode. Every meter gained cost more than the last. The Luftwaffe could still strike, but the closeness of the fighting limited its effectiveness. Artillery barrages shattered buildings, but also created more rubble for Soviet defenders to hide behind. Tanks lost their value in close-quarter labyrinths, and German morale suffered. They had expected to seize the city quickly, to move on to winter quarters, to declare victory in the south. Instead, they were trapped in a warren of ruins where time did not belong to them. Still, the city did not fall. By late October 1942, the Soviets held only a narrow strip along parts of the Volga, sometimes less than a kilometer deep, sometimes only a few hundred meters. It was a ribbon of survival, a broken shoreline where artillery pieces were dug into mud, where men lived in holes and cellars, where the river behind them was both salvation and grave. Yet this narrow holding was enough. It meant the Germans had not taken Stalingrad. It meant the Volga still flowed for Soviet logistics. It meant the German promise of Case Blue was now shackled to one unfinished city. The irony was quiet and cruel. Hitler had wanted Stalingrad as a stepping stone to secure the Caucasus Drive. Instead, Stalingrad became a sinkhole for German strength. Army Group A was deep in the mountains, starving for oil it could not yet use. Army Group B was bleeding in a city that would not die. The Wehrmacht was stretched in two directions, and in the space between those directions stood the Volga's ruined metropolis, refusing to yield. Inside Soviet headquarters, the defense of Stalingrad was never meant to be only defense. Even as Zhukov clung to the riverbank, Zhukov and other planners looked at German positions and saw their weakness. The Germans were deep in the city, but their flanks along the Don and Steppe were held largely by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian armies. These allies were brave, but they were poorly equipped for a vast Soviet counterstroke. Their anti-tank capabilities were limited. Their lines were thinner. Their morale was not anchored in the same ideological obsession that drove the Germans. Soviet commanders saw this and began to hold back reserves. Fresh armies, tanks, artillery, far behind the front, not to reinforce the city directly, but to prepare something larger. The Germans in Stalingrad did not fully see this gathering shadow. They were locked into their own immediate tunnel of rubble and fire. Every day was a fight for a few buildings. Every night was another attempt to survive. They believed the Soviets were pouring everything they had into those ruins. They did not yet grasp that the ruins were also a trap. So the first inferno of Stalingrad burned on. It was a battle of broken walls and exhausted men, of civilians living beneath the feet of armies, of a river that carried life through fire. It was not the decisive moment yet. It was the long, tightening grip before the decisive moment. The city, reduced to dust and iron, still stood in fragments because fragments were enough for survival. Winter approached. German troops dug in deeper. Soviet defenders welded themselves to earth and brick. And in the cold distances beyond the Don, Soviet reserves waited in silence, like a storm held behind a curtain. Stalingrad had not fallen, and because it had not fallen, the war in the south had not been won. The Germans did not know it yet, but the city they were trying to conquer was also conquering them, slowly, invisibly, and with the patience of a nation that had learned to endure. The inferno was only the beginning. The trap closes. Operation Uranus. By early November 1942, Stalingrad had been reduced to a thin, bleeding strip along the Volga. On German maps, it looked almost finished, just a few stubborn Soviet pockets refusing to die. From Paulus headquarters, the city appeared like a beast already mortally wounded, still thrashing, but only because habit had not yet caught up with death. The Sixth Army had taken most of the urban sprawl, had planted flags in the central districts, had fought its way through the factory belt in the north. The Volga shone behind the Soviets like a cold wall. Surely, the final push was only a matter of time. But Stalingrad no longer belonged to the logic of quick endings. The ruins had eaten the German timetable, the weather had begun to bite, and the defenders were still there, ragged, exhausted, sometimes holding nothing more than a basement and a shattered stairwell, yet still there. The city was a battlefield that could not be measured by percentage captured. A single block could consume a regiment. A single warehouse could become a week-long siege, and the Germans were gaining ground, but each gain weakened them. It was a victory that drained the victor. And beyond the city, hidden in the broad quiet of the steppe, something much larger was forming. Soviet High Command had never intended Stalingrad to be only a shield. It was also bait. While Zhukov's 62nd Army fought for every splinter of concrete, Zhukov and Vasilevsky worked on a plan that demanded patience so severe it bordered on cruelty. They watched Paulus sink deeper into the city. They watched his supply lines stretch thinner. They watched his flanks harden into brittle, exposed arms. Those flanks were not guarded by German panzer divisions. They were held mostly by Allied formations, Romanian armies to the north and south, with Italian and Hungarian units further out. These troops lacked the heavy armor and anti-tank weapons the Red Army now had in growing numbers. Their lines were long, their morale uneven, and their commanders knew they were standing between the Germans and the vast weight of Soviet reserves. The Soviet plan was simple in idea and immense in execution. Strike the flanks, not the city, and encircle Stalingrad itself. Instead of trying to push Paulus back street by street, they would cut him off, seal the Sixth Army inside the ruins he had fought so hard to enter, and let the city become a prison. This plan was named Operation Uranus. Its scale was staggering. The Soviets concentrated more than 1 million men, thousands of guns, and over 1,000 tanks in 2 great fists positioned north and south of Stalingrad. They did it quietly, under camouflage nets, at night, under the cover of regular traffic toward the front. They used deception, sending false radio chatter to suggest defensive preparations, hiding the movement of tank corps behind woods and folds in the land. The Germans heard rumors, they saw signs, but they interpreted them as local threats, not as a storm designed to swallow an army. On the morning of November 19th, the storm broke. A gray dawn hung over the northern steppe. Snow had begun to fall, delicate at first, then thickening into the air like dust. At 7:20 a.m., Soviet artillery opened with a fury that seemed to split the earth. Thousands of guns fired at once. The Romanian Third Army positions north of Stalingrad were smashed by a barrage so dense that survivors later said the sky looked solid with flame. Trenches collapsed. Communication lines died. Headquarters bunkers vanished under shock. Men who had been half frozen moments earlier were now thrown into chaos, deafened by the roar, blinded by smoke, and buried under torn earth. Then the Soviet tanks came forward through the mist. The Romanian lines, brave as many units were, could not hold against concentrated armor. Their anti-tank guns were too few. Their ammunition was old. In places, their defenses had no depth, only a thin forward screen. When T-34s and KV tanks rolled through, supported by masses of infantry, the Romanian front cracked quickly. There were pockets of resistance, desperate gun crews firing until tanks crushed their positions, infantry clinging to villages until they were overrun. But the momentum was Soviet, and it was overwhelming. By midday, the northern wing of Uranus had broken open a gap that widened each hour. The next day, November 20th, the southern blow fell. South of Stalingrad, the Romanian Fourth Army held ground across open steppe near Kotelnikovo and the Sarpa lakes. Here, too, Soviet artillery thundered, and here, too, Soviet armor surged through. The pattern repeated. Brittle defenses splintered, villages fell, and the Red Army poured into the rear like water through a breached dam. Soviet mechanized corps drove hard toward the west, aiming not to destroy every pocket, but to race past them, leaving infantry to mop up. Their task was speed. Their goal was to meet the northern spearheads and close the ring. Inside Stalingrad, Paulus and his staff received reports that came in fragments and then in floods. At first, the German command believed these attacks were serious but manageable. They expected local countermeasures, perhaps a shifting of reserves, perhaps a withdrawal from exposed salients. But the air of certainty had already slipped away. Their reserves were not near the flanks. They were inside the city, fighting for rubble. The German Panzer Corps that might have plugged such breaches had been stripped for other fronts months earlier. Now, Paulus had little to stop the Soviet breakthrough beyond hurried reinforcements, a few scattered armored battalions, and orders to hold. As Soviet columns raced west and then turned inward, a grim geometry appeared on maps. The lines were bending around Stalingrad, not away from it. The Red Army was not merely counterattacking, it was enveloping. By November 22nd, Soviet forces from north and south met near the town of Kalash on the Don. The pincers closed. The ring snapped shut around Stalingrad. More than 250,000 German and Allied troops were now trapped. The city that had been the object of conquest became, in a single week, an enormous encirclement pocket. It included the Sixth Army, parts of the Fourth Panzer Army, supply units, engineers, signals detachments, and thousands of wounded. The Germans had been told again and again that the Soviet system was nearly exhausted, that its reserves were gone, that its armies were on their last breath. The ring around Stalingrad proved that belief to be fantasy. For a moment, German command looked to retreat, while retreat was still possible. Paulus's staff urged a breakout westward before the Soviets hardened their ring. The Sixth Army still had tanks, still had guns, but Paulus was bound by two chains, the reality of frozen logistics and Hitler's will. The roads west were already clogged with Soviet armor. Fuel was scarce. Much of the army was exhausted from city fighting. A sudden breakout would mean abandoning tens of thousands of wounded and leaving behind much of the heavy equipment. Yet it was still, perhaps, the only chance. Hitler forbade it. From his headquarters, he sent an order that Stalingrad must be held as a fortress. The Sixth Army was to stay. Air supply would sustain it. A relief operation would come. No retreat was repeated with the tone of destiny. Paulus obeyed. In the following days, the encirclement became a new world of war. The Germans inside the pocket began to understand that their battlefield had changed. They were no longer attackers. They were surrounded defenders. Their front line was no longer a line but a circle. Every direction held an enemy. The Volga was useless to them. The Don crossings were in Soviet hands. Their supply depots were outside the ring. Their airfields were now within artillery range. The pocket was vast at first, roughly 50 kilometers across, but it was a prison all the same. The Luftwaffe, tasked with supplying the trapped army, faced an impossible arithmetic. Hermann Göring promised Hitler that airlift could deliver everything needed. It was a boast detached from physics. The Sixth Army required hundreds of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies each day to remain combat-ready. The transport fleets at hand could not carry that much, especially not in winter weather, under Soviet fighter threat, and across increasing distances. Planes were lost to flak. They were lost to icing. They were lost to crashes on makeshift runways. Even when flight succeeded, supplies fell far short. The pocket became a place where men waited for sacks of flour or boxes of cartridges as if they were miracles. Each delivery was precious. Each failure was felt as hunger. Inside Stalingrad itself, the fighting did not stop. It changed shape. Zhukov's forces still clung to their riverbank strip, still fought Germans across factory ruins. But now the Germans were fighting with the knowledge that they were trapped behind their own lines. Their ammunition was rationed. Their reinforcements were gone. Their wounds meant something different. A wounded man was no longer simply evacuated west. He was carried to a cellar hospital that might have no morphine and no heat. The city had become a layered grave. The Soviets, meanwhile, did not pause to celebrate. Uranus had closed the ring, but rings can be broken if they are thin. So they expanded outward quickly, pushing west to create space between the pocket and any relief force. They forestalled German counterattacks by smashing roads, seizing towns, and locking down rail lines. The encirclement was not a decorative loop. It was a tightening noose. German allies suffered badly in this collapse. Romanian divisions were effectively shattered. Survivors retreated in disarray, often without winter kits, often without weapons. Many were cut down in Soviet pursuit. Italian and Hungarian units further north began to feel the tremor of the Soviet offensive, sensing that their own lines might be the next to be broken. What had been a German-led spear into the Soviet south was now a fraying coalition defensive front, threatened in multiple places by Soviet strength that seemed to multiply in the cold. Inside the pocket, morale fractured along invisible lines. Some soldiers still believed relief was imminent. Others quietly understood the truth. Diaries from the period show a chilling shift. Early entries are about fighting, about securing blocks, about holding positions. Later entries become about bread, about frostbite, about the dull fear of being forgotten. Officers tried to maintain order. If discipline collapsed, so would the army. But starvation is a discipline of its own, and it works in reverse. It makes men think about survival before mission. Paulus walked a narrow corridor between loyalty and knowledge. He was not a flamboyant commander. He was methodical, more administrator than revolutionary tactician. His sense of duty was deep, and his fear of disobedience to Hitler was real. Yet his communications with Berlin grew more strained as the situation deteriorated. He asked for either a breakout authorization or a guaranteed relief. He received the same answer: hold. The pocket settled into a grim routine. Defensive lines were established around the outer perimeter. The Germans attempted local counterattacks to widen their circle, seize villages for food, and shorten lines. They fought Soviet probing assaults day after day, but each day depleted them further. Fuel stocks dwindled to the point that tanks were often dug in as immobile pillboxes. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Men burned anything that could burn to create warmth. Their winter clothing was insufficient. Frostbite claimed limbs. Disease spread in crowded shelters. Soviet artillery harassment felt endless. Shells fell not only on trenches but on makeshift airfields where supply planes tried to land, turning deliveries into scenes of panic. The Soviets, from outside, watched and tightened. They understood that time was now their ally. The longer the pocket held without relief, the weaker it would become. So they applied pressure without reckless waste, conserving their own strength for the final reduction. They also prepared for the inevitability of a German relief attempt. Reconnaissance tracked the buildup of forces near Kotelnikovo. Soviet commanders positioned reserves strategically, waiting for the next move. It was as if the battlefield itself exhaled into a slower, colder phase. The summer of sweeping arrows on maps was gone. In its place was winter geometry, inner ring, outer ring, supply lines stretching like brittle threads, armies waiting in snow-shadowed fields. The war here was no longer about movement. It was about endurance, exhaustion, and the slow work of sealing a fate. In Stalingrad, civilians who had survived the autumn inferno now faced another terror, living inside a trapped German fortress. Many were in hiding, surviving on crumbs. Some were forced into labor. Some were simply caught between lines. Their suffering was quiet, almost invisible on the grand maps. Yet it was part of the city's cruelty. Stalingrad had absorbed everyone who entered it: soldiers, workers, children, invaders. It gave nothing back without cost. As November ended, the Soviet ring remained firm. German aircraft still buzzed overhead like desperate insects, dropping supplies that vanished into a sea of need. Paulus men still fought on, because soldiers fight until their strength or their orders fail. And far to the west, German relief forces began to gather. The trap had closed. Now the world waited to see if it would hold. The snow deepened. The Volga flowed dark and slow beneath a skin of ice near its edges. And inside the ruins, an army slowly learned what it meant to be surrounded in Russia. Not for a night, not for a week, but for a winter. Winter in the cauldron. The ring around Stalingrad looked clean on a map, almost elegant. Two curved arms drawn by Soviet pencils meeting at Kalak, a circle closing around an enemy. But on the ground it was not a line at all. It was a landscape of frost, smoke, villages turned to splinters, and men who could see the trap but could not yet feel its full weight. For the Germans inside, the first days after encirclement still carried a strange, stubborn hope. The pocket was wide. The Soviet forces that had sealed it were racing, tired from the offensive. The Sixth Army still had structure, still had tanks, still had guns, and there had always been a way out before. One last push, one more breakthrough, another miracle of movement. That was how the war had worked for them since June 1941. But Stalingrad was not France, and the winter of 1942 was not a season for miracles. The trapped army began to call their world the Kessel, the cauldron. It was a fitting word because everything inside it felt like being slowly boiled down. The perimeter stretched for hundreds of kilometers, a rough circle across the steppe west of the city and around the shattered suburbs. Paulus men dug into frozen earth that refused to yield to shovels. They hacked trenches with pickaxes, blasted holes with grenades, burned scarce fuel just to soften the ground enough to scoop a shallow shelter. Whole divisions that had been attackers only weeks earlier were now spread thin as defenders, holding positions in snow-buried fields and half-destroyed hamlets. The cold turned every movement into labor. Boots grew stiff. Fingers lost feeling. Metal stuck to skin. The sky had a pale, flat look that made distances deceptive and nights feel endless. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army tried to reorganize itself in the new reality. Paulus established a defensive arc and divided forces into sectors, some holding the western rim, others clinging to the northern and southern edges. The remnants of the 4th Panzer Army inside the ring were worked into the perimeter where fuel allowed. But fuel was already melting away like breath in the air. Tanks were being parked in hull-down positions, engines silent, saved for moments that might never come. Horses, the old backbone of German logistics, were dying at a rate that made the roads look like dark stains against the snow. Those that survived were thin, bones pushing through skin, pulling wagons that carried little more than the despair of the men following behind. Food became the first truth of captivity. The pocket had not been stocked for a siege. It had been stocked for a final drive to the Volga. Supply depots had been left outside the ring. Others had been destroyed during the Soviet advance. The first rations cut the air with a quiet shock. Bread grew smaller. Meat disappeared. A soldier's day began to revolve around handfuls of black bread, watery soup, sometimes a bit of horseflesh that tasted more like necessity than sustenance. Men scraped ice for water. They boiled anything that could be boiled. Hunger does not roar at first. It murmurs. It enters the bones and makes thinking slow, makes officers' orders feel distant, makes the world narrow to stomach and cold. The Luftwaffe was supposed to save them. When the ring closed, Göring had assured Hitler that air supply could sustain the pocket. The promise spread through the Sixth Army like a blanket, fragile but warming. At first, planes did arrive in some numbers. Ju-52 transports, Heinkel bombers stripped for cargo, even wounded aircraft making desperate landings on makeshift fields. Airfields inside the pocket, Potomnik, Gumrak, Basargino, and others, became lifelines. When the transports came in, men ran out in the snow to unload sacks of flour, boxes of ammunition, drums of fuel, as if each crate was a heartbeat for the army. But the mathematics was merciless. The Sixth Army needed hundreds of tons of supplies every day. The Luftwaffe, battered and short of aircraft, could not deliver even half on most days. Weather grounded flights without warning. Fog rolled in, blizzards swallowed runways, winds froze engines and wings. Soviet fighter patrols grew bolder, hunting transports in the air and strafing them on approach. Artillery began to reach some airfields, turning landings into gambling throws. Even when planes arrived, they often carried the wrong things. Ammunition when food was needed, fuel when medical supplies were desperate. The cauldron was being fed by an eyedropper. Wounded men filled the hospitals and dugouts. They came in with frostbitten feet blackened by cold, with shrapnel wounds from Soviet shelling, with infections that spread quickly in damp cellars. Surgeons worked under lantern light, using instruments that were cleaned in snowmelt water, performing amputations because there was no other choice. Evacuation flights took out some of the wounded, the staff officers, the specialists, those who could still be saved. But the planes were too few, and each outgoing flight meant an incoming one was still uncertain. Many wounded remained where they fell. Some froze quietly overnight. Others begged to be taken to airfields that might already be under Soviet fire. It was a slow grinding of hope into something harder and quieter. Paulus watched all of this from his headquarters in a bunker near the city. He sent steady reports to Berlin. He asked again and again for permission to break out or for a relief operation to begin immediately. He knew the pocket could not hold indefinitely. His staff knew it. Field commanders knew it. But Hitler's orders remained absolute. Stalingrad was to be held. The Sixth Army was to stand as a fortress on the Volga. A relief force would come. The pocket was not to move. The Führer's will had become a kind of weather of its own, cold, distant, and unchangeable. To understand that order is to understand the style of war Hitler had chosen by late 1942. He was no longer simply seeking victory, he was seeking symbols. Stalingrad was a name he had vowed to erase. Allowing Paulus to fight his way out would feel, in Hitler's imagination, like surrendering that symbol. He believed holding the city would pin Soviet forces and preserve German prestige. He believed, too, that his will could bend reality. a habit of thought that had brought triumph in earlier years and now began to bring catastrophe. Within the pocket, German soldiers lived a strange double life. They were surrounded, but still fighting as if forward motion might return. Soviet assaults probed the perimeter daily. Infantry attacks came through gray dawns, supported by artillery and tanks. The Germans resisted fiercely, because soldiers surrounded by winter do not become gentle. They clung to villages, to ridges, to any line they could anchor. Sometimes they counterattacked to retake a farmhouse or a railway embankment. The battles were sharp and close. The snow caught fire from tracer rounds. Bodies froze into the ground where they fell. The fighting had less of the blur of maneuver now, and more the slow beating of a drum. Attack, defense, shelling, silence, repeat. In the city itself, scattered German units continued to press against Zhukov's remaining strip along the Volga. But their push had lost its old urgency. The factories in the north were still a jagged battlefield, but now German soldiers fought in ruins while knowing that their own rear was sealed. The city felt like a tomb they were being forced to guard from inside. Soviet artillery on the far bank of the Volga continued to fire into German positions, and supply barges still crossed at night, carrying bread and ammunition for the defenders. The Soviets had not only trapped the Germans, they had preserved their own lifeline. It was a quiet triumph of logistics amid chaos. And outside the ring, Soviet commanders were building a second wall. After Uranus, the Soviets understood the Germans would try to break the pocket from the outside. So they extended their offensive westward, widening the gap between Stalingrad and any relief force. They occupied towns, seized rail junctions, pushed German allies further back, and positioned reserves. The encirclement had two layers now: an inner ring to guard the pocket, and an outer ring to block rescue. It was patient warfare, shaped by the idea that time would do much of the killing. As December deepened, the pocket shrank in spirit even before it shrank in size. Hunger worsened. Bread rations dropped again. Fuel ran dangerously low, affecting everything from tanks to field kitchens. Men began to burn doors, fences, even furniture taken from ruined homes just to melt snow for water and keep frost from claiming fingers in sleep. It is one thing to fight a battle. It is another to fight the cold while hungry and surrounded. The cold does not accept bravery as payment. It asks only for heat, and if it does not receive it, it takes what it wants. Morale slid unevenly. Some units stayed sharp, clinging to discipline as a lifeline. Others began to fray. There were still officers giving hard speeches about duty, still men convinced relief was near. But the letters, the diaries, and the eyes told another story. Soldiers wrote about the silence between shelling. They wrote about the strange beauty of frost on ruined roofs. They wrote about dreams of bread, thick and warm, dreams that woke them with a more brutal hunger than before. When supply planes failed to come for days, the army felt abandoned. The pocket began to look less like a fortress and more like a waiting room for death. Yet still they held, because holding was all they were allowed to do. In Berlin, preparations for a relief operation finally moved forward. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had been given command of the newly formed Army Group Dawn, tasked with saving the 6th Army. He was one of Germany's most capable commanders, a master of operational maneuver, and he understood the urgency. The relief plan took shape under the name Operation Winter Storm. Its spearhead would be the 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, massed near Kotelnikovo, southwest of Stalingrad. Their goal was to drive northeast, smash through Soviet outer defenses, and link up with Paulus. Inside the pocket, rumors of Manstein's coming spread fast. They were not even rumors by mid-December. They were spoken as fact. Men stared westward at night. Officers pointed on maps. "Relief is coming," they said. "Hold a little longer." And soldiers do what soldiers have always done in war. They hold because they must. Because hope is sometimes the only ration left. The Soviets also knew relief was coming. Their reconnaissance and intelligence networks tracked German buildup. They understood Manstein's intent, and they understood that the more they weakened the pocket before relief arrived, the easier it would be to crush it if relief failed. So they tightened their pressure in a measured way, probing, shelling, cutting roads inside the ring, capturing outposts, forcing the Germans to expend ammunition they could no longer replace. The pocket became a place where every bullet fired felt like a decision with no good outcome. If you conserve ammunition, you risk being overrun. If you spend it, you risk having none left when you need it most. The war inside Stalingrad was becoming less about victory than about delaying the moment of collapse. Airfields, once lifelines, turned into symbols of narrowing chance. Potomnik became a battlefield in itself, with wounded men gathered in heaps waiting for flights that might not arrive. When a transport landed, the scene could turn violent, not from cruelty, but from hunger and fear. Men fought to load wounded. Officers tried to keep order with shouted commands. The engines of planes idled like a ticking clock, because every minute on the ground meant Soviet shells might find their mark. Still, the snow fell softly over everything, indifferent. At moments, Stalingrad could appear almost quiet. A ruined street at dusk, a frozen river under a pale moon, smoke rising slowly from a distant village. War has these strange, calm intervals, even in its worst places. That calm can feel like mercy. It can also feel like the inhale before drowning. By late December, the 6th Army was weakening visibly. Units were down to fractions of strength. Frostbite cases were soaring. Horses were nearly gone. Fuel was measured in drips. Men were living on starvation rations. Yet their perimeter still existed. Their guns still fired. Their officers still saluted. The German army had always been trained to endure hardship with discipline, and that training now kept the pocket alive beyond what logic predicted. But endurance is not the same as escape. What the Germans inside the cauldron did not yet fully grasp was that even if Manstein reached them, a link-up would require action from within, an outward breakout to meet the relief force. It would mean abandoning Stalingrad itself, opening a corridor west, and moving fast. Paulus knew this. His generals knew it. But he also knew that any breakout required Hitler's authorization. Without it, he would be disobeying a direct order, and that was a line Paulus had never crossed. So the pocket waited. In the cold, waiting becomes its own kind of battle. It stretches time. It makes each day feel like a winter in miniature. Men wake up hungry and go to sleep hungrier. They listen for engines in the sky. They count the shells that still fall. They hold rifles that feel like blocks of ice. And all the while, beyond the perimeter, Soviet armies were preparing their answer to any German rescue attempt. Winter in the cauldron was not just a season. It was a slow transformation of an army into a shadow of itself. The 6th Army had marched into Russia believing in speed and destiny. Now it sat in ruins believing in supply planes and promises. The difference between those beliefs was the difference between conquest and captivity. And as December slipped toward its darkest days, the lights on the horizon were no longer the fires of Stalingrad alone. They were the approaching headlights of Manstein's panzers, and the quiet Soviet resolve to make sure those lights never reached the ring. Winter storm and the long night in the pocket. By mid-December 1942, the Stalingrad pocket had settled into a frozen routine. snow sifted through roofless factories and along trenches carved into rubble. 6th Army's world was now an oval of ruin on the west bank of the Volga, held together by brittle tracks, field kitchens with almost nothing to cook, and the 2 airfields, Pitomnik and Gumrak, that served as the last thread to the outside. Each dawn brought the same anxious question: would the transports come? And if they did, would they bring enough to keep men on their feet for one more day? Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army. On paper, the 6th Army needed about 600 to 700 tons of food, fuel, and ammunition per day to remain a fighting force. In practice, the airlift rarely delivered even a third of that. Blizzards grounded aircraft, Soviet fighters stalked the approaches. The long distance from German bases ate into payloads, and air crews flew into a storm of flak that thickened week by week. When planes did land, they often had to unload under shelling, engines still turning, their crews knowing that if they lingered the runway would be cratered and the return impossible. Relief on the ground was the only real hope. After the encirclement of late November, Hitler appointed Field Marshal Erich von Manstein to command Army Group Don. Manstein was a master of mobile war, and he understood the arithmetic of the pocket. 6th Army had to be relieved quickly, or it had to break out while it still had some mobility. Every day of hunger reduced that mobility. Yet Manstein was ordered to attempt a rescue without giving Paulus permission to move unless Berlin approved. It was strategy by leash, and the leash was held by a man who would not accept retreat. On 12th of December, Operation Winter Storm began. The cold was so sharp that tank tracks rang on the frozen ground like hammers on stone, and exhaust hovered in pale clouds behind the columns. At first, the Germans advanced with a speed that felt like summer returning. Soviet units in that sector had been shifting after Operation Uranus, and Winter Storm's opening blows ripped gaps in thin lines. Villages such as Aksay and Sovetski changed hands quickly as panzers skirted ravines, cut through snow-covered steppe, and left infantry to clear what they bypassed. For a few days, the relief force seemed to be moving on a road that still belonged to German will and German engines. But the Soviet High Command had expected the attempt, and reserves were already positioned to meet it. Fresh guards formations in the 51st Army moved into Hoth's path. Anti-tank guns were dug into snowbanks along likely approaches. T-34s waited hull down behind low ridges, their crews patient in the white silence. When German armor pushed forward, Soviet units bent, then struck at flanks and supply tails. Near the Mishkova River, the relief force met a wall of guns and tanks, and the wide steppe narrowed into a killing ground of burning vehicles and shattered villages. The Germans advanced, but each kilometer cost more fuel, more steel, and more men than the last. Inside Stalingrad, Manstein signaled Paulus repeatedly, "Be ready to break out toward the relief force as soon as it drew near." Paulus read the orders in a cold bunker lit by a single bulb. He knew 6th Army's remaining fuel and strength were measured in hours, not days. Many of the tanks that still existed were already immobile, cannibalized for parts, or stuck as silent pillboxes in the ruins. Infantry divisions were thin, frostbitten, and living on rations that barely counted as food. Yet Hitler's command still stood. Stalingrad must be held, and a breakout was forbidden unless ordered by the Führer himself. Paulus hesitated, trapped between obedience and survival, and the moment for initiative drifted away like smoke in the wind. On 19th of December, the crisis sharpened. The Soviet Second Guards Army under Rodion Malinovsky slammed into Hoth's front around Verkhnekunsky and the Mishkova line. A blizzard of artillery opened the attack, tearing open the frozen earth, and then Soviet armor surged forward, engines loud and confident in the cold. German panzers fought at close range, firing until barrels steamed. Crews, half-blind from frost and smoke, worked their turrets with numb hands, while grenadiers clung to vehicle hulls and leapt off into drifts to clear anti-tank positions. They held on by skill and stubbornness, but they were bleeding strength they could not replace. Then the Soviets struck where Manstein was weakest. Operation Little Saturn crashed into the Axis allies holding the German flanks along the Don, especially the Italian Eighth Army. Spread thin, short of anti-tank weapons and exhausted, the Italians collapsed under Soviet tank corps. The breakthrough rolled westward toward Manstein's rear, threatening to sever the rail lines feeding Hoth. In a single week, the landscape behind the relief force changed from a supporting base into a danger zone. The attempt to save a Sixth Army now risked creating another pocket, this time around the rescuers themselves. Manstein had to choose: keep pushing and lose the army group, or pull back and abandon Sixth Army. On 23 December, he ordered Hoth to halt and withdraw toward Kotelnikovo. Winter storm was over. The German columns turned back through the snow, leaving burned-out vehicles like dark bones on the steppe. Inside Stalingrad, the news spread by radio and by silence. No rescue was coming. Some men refused to believe it at first. Others simply sat, too tired for anger. The pocket had lost its last candle. The airlift now became the only road, and even that road was narrowing. Soviet fighters hunted the transport stream, flak belts thickened, and storms grounded planes for days. When aircraft did arrive, their cargo was sometimes a cruel mismatch: ammunition without fuel to move it, fuel without enough food to keep men strong enough to fight. Potomnik and Gumrak came under constant shelling, and every landing felt like a wager with death. Crews skidded onto icy runways while loaders ran, forward in the open, dragging sacks and crates into waiting trucks, knowing that the next salvo might erase the airfield entirely. On 24 December, a Soviet tank raid hit the Luftwaffe base at Tatsinskaya, one of the key hubs of the air bridge. Tanks burst into the airfield with engines roaring and guns already firing. Planes were burned on the ground, fuel stores exploded, and the Luftwaffe was forced to shift operations farther west. Every extra mile of flight meant less cargo, fewer sorties, and more time over hostile skies. For Sixth Army, the raid was like a door quietly closing. Inside the pocket, the drop in supplies was felt immediately. Rations slid toward a few hundred calories a day. Bread came as thin gray slices, flour stretched with cellulose and other substitutes. Horses had long since been eaten. Now men boiled leather harnesses, scraped marrow from old bones, and chewed frozen beet pulp meant for animals. Malnutrition spread like a quiet fog. Faces hollowed. Winter infections that healthy bodies might have resisted became lethal. In field hospitals, surgeons worked with dull saws and almost no anesthetic, deciding with a glance who might live and who would simply be made comfortable while the cold did the rest. Ammunition was hoarded. Artillery batteries fell silent not because targets were absent, but because shells were gone. Paulus tried to keep order with daily reports and the habit of staff work, as if a neat map could hold chaos at bay. The defensive perimeter contracted as Soviet attacks nibbled away at its edges. The Red Army did not rush. It worked forward with methodical pressure. Artillery to shatter a position, infantry to take it, tanks to seal the gain, tightening the ring and increasing the density of starving men inside. Every German withdrawal was a few hundred meters of lost ground and a few more men too weak to move, left behind in cellars or snow-filled trenches. Yet German units still fought hard in places the Soviets had learned to respect. In the tractor factory district, along the Red October works, around the shattered apartment blocks by the Tsaritsa Gorge. Even when they were starving, they were disciplined enough to turn ruins into fortresses. Hitler's messages grew more rigid as the situation grew more bleak. Late in the month, he promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a rank that carried an old expectation. A field marshal did not surrender. Paulus understood the meaning, but also the futility. Personal death would not feed his army, and a dramatic refusal to live would not change the geometry of the pocket. Still, he obeyed. Hope, by now, was less a belief in rescue than a stubborn refusal to admit the end, a habit as hard to break as the ice that coated the ruins. At night, Soviet loudspeakers drifted calm voices toward German lines. They offered surrender, warm food, medical care. Leaflets fluttered into trenches promising life rather than execution. Some Germans mocked them aloud because to do anything else felt like weakness. Others tucked them away in their pockets with numb fingers, like forbidden medicine. In the cold, the idea of surrender was no longer fantasy. It was a presence that sat beside hunger. Yet the front still held because routine held. Men stood guard because they had stood guard yesterday, because the next hour needed a sentry the same way a body needs breath, even when breath hurts. Winter Storm's failure was a turning of the season in the war. It showed that Germany's mobile reserves in the south could be checked, that Axis flanks could be broken, and that Stalingrad could become a grave rather than a gateway. Most of all, it left 6th Army in a long, tightening night. The pocket was now a wounded creature surrounded by hunters who had learned patience, confident that time and frost were already fighting on their side. As 1942 gave way to the new year, the men along the Volga lived in shrinking spaces and smaller dreams. A candle stub guarded from the wind. A shared cigarette passed along a trench, its glow briefly warming the face of each man who drew on it. A memory spoken softly, so it would not feel like a taunt to those who had nothing left. The sky, once filled with the promise of salvation, now carried mostly silence. The Volga ice thickened. The wind kept coming, and somewhere beyond the frozen steppe, Soviet guns were being moved closer, one careful mile at a time, preparing the final act that the starving men of 6th Army could already sense, even before they heard it. From the frozen gates to the long road west, the winter outside Moscow did not end the war. It only changed its rhythm. When the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back from the capital in December 1941, Red Army soldiers felt something they had not felt since June: space to breathe, and the first quiet belief that survival could turn into victory. The front stabilized after weeks of bitter fighting. Snow buried wrecked tanks and frozen horses. Villages that had changed hands 3 times in a month stood half empty, their chimneys broken, their fields torn by shells. Both armies were exhausted, but the meaning of exhaustion was different now. For the Germans, it was the shock of a dream collapsing. For the Soviets, it was the cost of proving they could not be destroyed in a single season. Hitler tried to transform defeat into stubbornness. He ordered his troops to hold where they stood, even when holding meant starving in ice-sealed trenches. Some German commanders obeyed, some bent the order in secret, pulling back a few kilometers to save their men from encirclement. Either way, the Wehrmacht entered 1942 no longer as a spear racing east, but as a wall forced to stand against a hostile continent. The Soviet Union, battered beyond imagination, also entered the new year changed. It had lost millions of soldiers and civilians, entire regions burned or occupied, yet the state remained intact. The factories moved beyond the Urals were now turning out tanks and guns in volumes Germany had not expected. New armies were being formed in the east. not because the Soviets had endless strength, but because the alternative was extinction. In the occupied lands, a shadow war continued without pause. The German rear was never truly calm. Partisans cut rail lines, destroyed bridges, and ambushed supply columns that already struggled to travel across distances measured in days. German reprisals grew harsher, tightening the spiral of hatred. The occupation had begun as conquest. It became a furnace that consumed everything around it. Every village burned for suspected resistance. Every family starved for refusing to hand over grain, deepened the Soviet conviction that this war was not about borders, but about existence. That conviction would become the fuel of the years ahead. In the spring and summer of 1942, Hitler tried to seize the initiative again. With Moscow still standing, he turned south, toward the wheat fields of Ukraine and the oil of the Caucasus. The logic was strategic, but it was also ideological. Lebensraum, resources, and a belief that one more thunderous campaign would break the USSR. German armies drove toward the Volga, their maps now centered on Stalingrad. The city was not chosen only for its factories or its river traffic. Its name was a dare. To take it would be to cut the Soviet Union in half and to strike at the myth of Stalin himself. Stalingrad became the mirror of Moscow, but darker. In the ruins by the Volga, fighting shrank to rooms, stairwells, basements, and broken factories where the air smelled of dust and cordite. German soldiers advanced step by step, while Soviet defenders clung to the riverbank as if it were the last edge of the world. The city was devoured piece by piece, until the battle no longer looked like movement on a map, but like a slow grinding of human bodies against concrete and fire. And when winter returned, the trap that the Germans had once sprung so brilliantly on others closed around them instead. Soviet forces encircled the Sixth Army in November 1942, sealing the pocket on the steppe. Hunger, cold, and despair returned, this time wearing field gray uniforms. The final Soviet offensive to crush the pocket, Operation Ring, began in January 1943, squeezing the remaining German positions inward with artillery and infantry assaults. Potomnik and then Gumrak, the last airfields that fed the doomed airlift, fell as the noose tightened. Stalingrad front, .com+1. In cellars and shattered courtyards, German soldiers listened to the roar of Soviet guns as their world shrank by the hour. When Paulus surrendered at the end of January, and the last German resistance ended on February 2, 1943, the war crossed a psychological boundary. Grokopedia. It was no longer possible to believe in a German victory in the East that resembled 1941. Stalingrad did not merely destroy an army, it destroyed a prophecy. After Stalingrad came the long, brutal arc westward. In 1943, at Kursk, Germany attempted one last great armored offensive, hoping to regain initiative with steel and will. It failed against deep Soviet defenses and overwhelming reserves. From then on, the Red Army advanced with a growing confidence shaped by experience and blood. Cities that had been names in German communiques became places of retreat, then disaster. Ukraine was fought over again, this time with Soviet strength rising while German strength thinned. The front widened, and the war turned into a contest of production, endurance, and the ability to replace what was lost. The Soviet Union could replace more. Germany could not. To the west, the wider world changed too. Lend-Lease trucks rumbled across Soviet roads, carrying fuel and food that stretched Soviet logistics farther than home industry alone could manage. Allied bombers struck German factories. In 1944, the Western Allies landed in France, forcing Hitler to fight a two-front war he had hoped to avoid. Meanwhile, the Red Army launched Operation Barbarossa, smashing German Army Group Center and clearing Belarus with a force that echoed the scale of Barbarossa itself. only now moving in reverse. The same forests and rivers that had swallowed Soviet armies in 1941 became the corridors of Soviet advance. The war that began as a lightning invasion became a rolling avalanche. In the winter and spring of 1945, the Soviet armies reached Germany. East Prussia, Silesia, the Oder River, each became a threshold crossed with terrible cost. Soldiers who had seen their homes burned and families murdered entered enemy territory with a hard, quiet fury. Berlin, once the distant heart of the Reich, became a city of rubble and fire. Street fighting returned, as it had in Stalingrad. Only now, the Red Army was the force pushing through broken buildings toward a final bunker. When the German capital fell and Hitler died, the war in Europe ended not in a single moment of triumph, but in a great collapse of exhaustion, grief, and relief. And yet, even in victory, the Eastern Front left scars that never truly closed. The Soviet Union had survived, but at a cost that reshaped its people and its future. Tens of millions were dead. Entire towns were graves. The old world of pre-war Europe was gone, replaced by a continent divided by fear and memory. The war's brutality ensured that peace would not be gentle. It would be guarded, suspicious, and heavy with the weight of what had been endured. When we look back at Barbarossa and the Battle of Moscow, the opening storm of this immense struggle, we see the hinge on which everything turned. Germany's failure before Moscow meant there would be no quick end, no neat conquest. It meant Stalingrad would happen, Kursk would happen, Berlin would happen. It meant that a war intended to last months became a war that consumed years and worlds. The winter of 1941 did not defeat Germany alone. But it proved Germany could be defeated, and once that proof existed, the Soviet Union and its allies had something priceless: time. If this journey through the frozen fields, shattered cities, and unbreakable endurance has held you, I'd love for you to stay with us. Subscribe to Lullaby of Empires for more calm, immersive history. Stories told slowly, clearly, and with the respect these lives and moments deserve.